For order. Welcome to this morning's session of the Business and Trade Select Committee, in which we are looking at the collapse of Wilko and the lessons for policy reform at the Department for Business and Trade. Thank you very much to those witnesses who are joining us for the first panel. Our goal with this first panel is really to set the stage for the later hearings that we've got that follow you. Because time is so limited, we're just asking for really concise and punchy answers. We, as you can imagine, are briefed up to the nines, but we would really be grateful to you for helping make sure that we have got all the facts on the table before we move into our subsequent hearings. So, Nadine Houghton, perhaps I could turn to you first.
Yeah.
Just tell us very briefly, if you can, why did Wilko fail? And who, if anyone, was responsible? And then I'll put the same question to Mr. O'Brien.
GMB doesn't believe that the collapse of Wilko was inevitable. We think that actually what resulted from what brought about the collapse was weak leadership and a failure of Wilko to adapt to a changing market. The consistent face on the leadership team was, of course, Lisa Wilkinson, who you'll be speaking to later. So we do believe that she bears a significant amount of responsibility. We saw under her directorship a high churn in executive directors, no CEO for a period of at least 8 years. And during this time as well, huge amounts of dividends were taken out of the business, 77 million over the past decade. Millions were taken out by Lisa Wilkinson and used for her angel investments instead of, as we would believe they should be, being invested in Wilko to improve their online offering, to make sure that they are competitive on price, to make sure that their shops are fit for purpose. Clearly they had a lot of high street stores where their competitors were moving on to retail units. And it's those kind of changes that Wilko just really didn't adapt to.
So we've got failures there of strategic leadership, operational leadership, some financial issues, but encapsulated by a failure of leadership at the business.
Failure of leadership and a lack of accountability.
Perfect. Okay, thank you, Patrick. What's your take on that question?
My take is that Wilko's demise has to be seen in terms of longer-term competitive context. The retailer was doing quite well up until about 2012, but has really struggled over the last 10 years. This is not a problem that's just is just happened over the last couple of years. Or indeed because of COVID or the cost of living crisis. So it's a longer term issue, and they've come up against much stronger competitors. That's in terms of supermarkets who've pushed more into home sales. They've increased from 2% of their sales mix to over 3%. But then there's the competitive context of the likes of Home Bargains and B&M, who've grown very, very rapidly with a much more compelling offer that Wilko has had, and they've grabbed market share from Wilko, as have other players such as Savers, and to a lesser extent the likes of Hobbycraft, also Dunelm, for example, in homewares. So they've been attacked from all sides, and what it seems to me is that Wilko really was a sense of inertia. They didn't really do enough. They had the wrong store, store locations, wrong store type. They're far too big, their stores. They had lower sales densities than any of their major competitors, and they didn't really react. They kept on with a high street model. They didn't really push into retail parks at all, and that was where the likes of B&M and Home Bargains were having their successes.
How long did that inertia last? I mean, if you were to track it back over the last however many years.
Well, they ran out of room in terms of like-for-like sales growth. In 2012, their operating margin never recovered beyond 1.7% over the last 10 years, which, when their competitors were much higher. They didn't react at all, as far as I can see.
They were in a pretty unique position in 2009 after the collapse of Woolworths to help consolidate that particular sector of the market, though. Is that fair to say?
That's true, and they grew all through the early 2000s. They were one of the reasons that that Woolworths eventually collapsed, and they were growing stores all the way through to about 2014, maybe 15.
Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, just to come in, we've got correspondence between ourselves and Wilko where they identify challenging trading position from about 2010, and they identify that the discount retailers are an issue. However, what we see is instead of really leaning into that and accepting that that is a challenge, that they're actually very well placed to adapt to, as you've identified in this post-Woolworths austerity economy of sort of 2009, 2010. And actually what you see is a move away from this idea of Wilko as a value retailer, discount retailer. And actually they have this rebranding process which is completed in 2015 where they move from Wilkinson to Wilko. And the internal messaging to our members, obviously I represent team members within Wilko, was very much this attempt to move to almost a John Lewis type model. That was the internal messaging that our members on the shop floor got. It was a complete departure from the idea of Wilko as a family brand and a discount retailer. And actually under NDA in December 2022, we raised our concerns with the then CEO, Jerome St Mark, that Wilko was moving away from its roots and doing what it had done well for so many years. And he unequivocally told GMB that Wilko was not a discount retailer. And our members really chart the beginning of the end around 2014, 2015, where they just move away from this discount approach.
If we then just go forward a couple of years to say 2021, the cash position in the business remains very strong. They're recording about 107 million in net cash in 2021. When were you told as a trade union that there were problems at play?
We were not really ever directly told. We were told that there were trading difficulties. No, the consistent message that we had from Wilko was we're in a strong position, we're in a strong cash position. As you've said, they preserved a lot of cash in the bank, but we have a turnaround plan. We recognise that there's difficulties, but we have a turnaround plan. And the strap line was power to 2030. Mm-hmm. So we were consistently told we've got this robust turnaround plan, we've got lots of cash in the bank, nothing to see here, nothing to worry about. And it wasn't until there was lots of press speculation around the middle of 2022 that we actually asked for this meeting with the then CEO, Jerome St Mark, to be told, again, no problem here, we're not a discount retailer, we have a plan. And only a matter of weeks later, a new CEO was appointed, who you'll be speaking to later, Mark Jackson. And actually, he did seem to have a plan. He did seem to understand what it is that Wilko needed to do in order to survive. Unfortunately, it was just too little, too late. And we found out as well from press speculation, unfortunately, that Wilko board were advised that they needed to enact a CVA in the middle of 2022 in order to bring their rents down. And again, this inertia, this just inaction when something clearly needed to be done.
Now, you're under parliamentary privilege here, but I think you have also been released from an NDA.
We have, yeah.
What did you learn from that you can now share with us?
Really, what I've just told you. I mean, there wasn't any, not a high level of detail. The meeting that we had with Mark Jackson was also under NDA, and that was in the January. And at that time, we were told that the rents were 40% above market rates. Wow. So we have this picture where the board have been advised in 2022 they need to enact a CVA for various reasons, and I'm sure you'll ask Lisa later why that wasn't acted upon. We then have a meeting with the CEO who tells us everything's fine, we've got a strong cash position. And then come January 23, the new CEO is telling us, actually, our rents are 40% above market rates. And yes, we've got a turnaround plan, but clearly, as we all know, it was too little, too late.
So we've got a failure to consolidate after the collapse of Woolworths. We've then got a rebranding exercise after 2014, which is about the time that the business was bought out by Ms. Wilkinson.
Correct.
We've then got, frankly, a slow decline in which problems appear to snowball, but there wasn't a lot of transparency about those problems with you.
Not even so no transparency, but no acknowledgement of the issues, no humility from anybody at a board level to be able to sit back and go, actually, our strategy isn't working. The discount retailers are hugely eating into our market share. We were in a prime position to capitalise on that. Okay, we missed our chance there, but what do we need to do differently now? And actually what you see is this real digging in of, I've mentioned the sort of John Lewis type model, but that sort of culture persists, and you see that in the director churn as well.
Do you think the board of Wilkinson were in denial, or did they just not care?
I can only tell you what I pick up on anecdotally from feedback from our members, and the feedback from our members is very much that Lisa Wilkinson had an idea about how she wanted the business to be run. You see the opening of the High Street Kensington Wilko. I mean, if that doesn't speak to a vanity project, then I'm not really sure what does. You have this Winnovate extension added to the head office on an industrial estate in Worksop, which again, it just looks like a vanity project. It's completely out of place. So you see, for example, the investment in these driverless drones that as part of Lisa's angel investment strategy. So it was very much, I think, that Lisa had an idea about Wilko, what Wilko should be, but it was a complete departure from actually what Wilko is and what Wilko had always been and done well.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Mr. Palsy.
Thank you, Chairman. We've heard about leadership and failure to understand the market. I want to ask Professor Shah, if I may, about the financial aspects of Wilko. And so you're an expert in accounting and corporate governance and also regulation. I wanted to pick those two bits separately. So in terms of accounting and corporate governance, why weren't these things picked up by the auditors?
A very, very good question, and that's what I have been asking whilst looking at the accounts. PricewaterhouseCoopers were the auditors before 2019, and EY took over in 2019. Now, so these problems have been building up for some time, as my colleagues have just said. And of course, they are very simple in a way for an auditor to recognize the problems. It's not difficult because the turnover is high, but the margins are very low and they are declining. And there was a big loss in 2018 of 56 million, and it's in 2019 that PwC resigned as auditors. So what we have, as a profession, and I'm a member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants, we have a duty to protect the public interest. We have a duty, we are trained to spot these kinds of problems. We are supposed to bring our expertise. We are supposed to be independent.
Professor Shah, what went wrong?
What went wrong is basically the auditors didn't do their job. If we look closely at the audit opinions, whilst PwC was an auditor, there is a section in the audit opinion called going concern. And in that section, the paragraph reads that this company is a going concern and, everything is fine. However, the last sentence says, however, we cannot guarantee the future of the company because of the uncertainty that surrounds it.
Professor Shah, is this both auditors? Is this PwC in the period prior to 2019?
Yeah.
As well as EY after? So two of the big four failed to do their job properly. Is that what you're telling us?
Well, without any doubt.
Without any doubt.
But if you look carefully at the way they phrased the audit report, they protected themselves. So we are hearing just now about how the family who owned the business protected themselves at the expense of the workers. Here you got auditors protecting themselves.
Tell us how they went about doing that. How were they able to protect themselves and not protect the workers and the customers and the suppliers of the business?
Well, so in the last audited accounts in 2022, when EY were the auditors, the normal period of audit is 3 months after the month end. EY waited for 9 months, which is the last deadline to publish the audit report.
Why do you think they did that?
Well, clearly because there were serious problems, and by coincidence, it so happens that the headquarters in Worksop, the distribution center, was sold the day before the audit report was signed for 50 million. So that cash injection that brought in was able to keep the organization going, right?
But we heard in 2021 the cash position was strong. Why did it deteriorate so quickly, and what was done to deal with it? The sale of the building, presumably, then?
Yeah, so I suspect, you see, we only have public information. The auditors have a lot of inside information, right? So from the public information, what I can discern is that Barclays had a loan, a temporary, a kind of working capital loan of about 25 million, and they were calling for that loan back. And the cash was very short. So they were forced to make a sale of one of their core buildings, properties, and out of that sale, effectively the auditors took comfort that, okay, temporarily there is a reprieve, right? But when you read the audit report, there is a statement where they say there is a material uncertainty relating to going concern, but then overall it says the accounts give a true and fair view of the group's affairs. Now, you know, if a company is insolvent, then the whole accounts change completely because the valuations change, right? So, in a sense, when you look at the audit report, it's a bit like they've passed, but they've failed, but they've passed again, and they've failed. So when you're reading it, you're not getting a very clear indication of what is the judgment about the future of the company.
Right. So what should the auditors have written? What should they have said that they didn't say?
The accounts do not give a true and fair view. And not just in 2021, they should have said that at least 3 years
When
earlier.
an auditor sees accounts that don't give a true and fair view,
Yeah.
what action should they take? To be fair to PwC, they resigned. Is that not adequate action?
No, not at all.
What should they have done?
They should have reported it in the audit report. You know, that's when they express the opinion. We hire experts, and remember, these experts are very well paid to provide judgment and independent analysis and to help with the corporate governance of a public company, right? So they failed in doing that, clearly, but they covered themselves because I think in a court of law, they would not be able to
if they'd realised what the serious state of the company's finances was?
Very good question. Now, this very committee did a fantastic report on the future of audit in 2019, which covered all these aspects. And one of the key recommendations made by this committee was that auditors have a duty to look forward, not just backward. And they need to exercise clear judgment and be independent, right? So in this case, so what happened, if you look at the last audited accounts, the directors created projections for the cash flow of the business, and the auditors said that, look, there is uncertainty surrounding the business, but we've looked at the cash flows and we feel that the business will survive for another year until 2024. Now, the future of audit report that this committee said, the public should expect much better than that of these independent professionals. Yeah? So they didn't get it.
And how important do you think that reform is?
Oh, it's long overdue, but unfortunately, there have been fantastic reviews. The Bryden report looked at all the audit profession in detail and the kind of changes to the audit report in detail, and beautifully done, very professional. All of these reports have been put into abeyance. And the profession is not independent. You know, I mean, I've looked, the Institute of Chartered Accountants, which is the main audit professional body, they provide templates for the audit report. So auditors effectively don't have to really write the audit report. They just take a template out.
Mr. McDonald is going to ask about some of the systemic issues, but I just want to check one thing. If the company was bleeding so much cash in 2021, 2022, that Barclays was recalling its loan, it sounds like a gap was plugged at the very last minute by the sale of the distribution centre in Worksop. If you're plugging gaps with a one-off sale, that's not a going concern.
Absolutely. So, but again, remember, so the auditors delayed the audit report by 6 months.
Presumably in order for the sale of the distribution centre to come through and the cash to arrive.
But that is also not very professional, because if their duty is to protect the public interest, they should be timely and they should be willing to exercise judgment and take risk. Otherwise, what is their job?
Okay.
What is their job?
We'll bring in Andy McDonald. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair.
Thanks,
Professor Shah, can I just develop that theme somewhat? Because when we look back, BHS 2016, Carillion, Patisserie Valerie, London Capital Finance, Thomas Cook, NMC Health and Greensill Capital, they all demonstrate major audit failures. There's been heavy criticism of the Big Four and others involved in those. But you've argued that those failures are linked to systemic failures in corporate governance, and you've called for audit reforms. Do you want to say a little bit more about those key reforms? And can I invite you to comment on the market being dominated by such a small cohort of auditors? France, I understand, has a 27 players in this market, and double auditing. What are the reforms that you would want to see, and which are the urgent ones?
Yeah, I mean, there is a long list, but I'll start with the independence issue. So at the moment, these are broad-based. The Big Four are, as you rightly say, very large, have a large market share, very influential, but also they provide a whole A to Z of services. So there are plenty of conflicts of interest. Just looking at the Wilko example, PwC were the auditors, then they resigned, then they became consultants to Wilko. So they were helping them with the restructuring. There's a £500,000 bill which was unpaid at the time of the administration, and now suddenly from that they've become the insolvency practitioners. Right. So and then I saw there's also Deloitte is a creditor on this. So the Big Four are helping Wilko in different ways. We found the same in Carillion, right? So all the time, where is the public interest? Where is the independence? The independence should be separated. So they should not be allowed to cross-sell services, and they should be separated. Audit should be separated, and they should be broken up. Those are simple examples. Another important thing is about the forward-looking aspect of the audit. It shouldn't just be about the past. There should be about the future, and not just 1 year into the future, but at least 3 to 5 years. Bryden Review covers that, and auditors also need to be. There is also this talk about the auditors not being appointed by the company, because the company is not the client. The client is the public and the shareholders, creditors. There's a whole range of stakeholders who rely on a good quality independent audit, right? So therefore, there is a talk about the public appointment of auditors. So the government appoints the auditors to different companies rather than them choosing their auditors, right? Now, the point that was raised earlier about the transfer between PwC and EY, now that transfer of auditors, the only requirement is that one auditor should write to the other to make sure that there are no unforeseen risks in the business which the other auditor should be aware of. But that's a secret letter. Now, Bryden said that letter should be made public. Whenever there's a transition of auditors, we should see that. Auditors should appear in front of the AGM. At the AGM, people can ask auditors to look at particular aspects of the business which are not covered, but which are seen to be risky by the stakeholders of the business. The kinds of issues that Nadine is saying.
You're saying that does not happen now?
Not at all.
No. So we've got an issue that they're not only the same people, are auditors, insolvency practitioners, consultants, but they're investors as well. You're basically telling us that just is simply unsustainable as a way for as the architecture in this space.
And given that they have such access to internal information about the business on a regular basis, which the public do not have, they are supposed to do their job properly and reliably and accurately so that we can be protected, so that jobs can be protected, creditors can be protected. There are so many small creditors who lost out on this.
So given that, what's your take on the government's response to this? This is something it isn't a new area to us. This has been known. Is the current legislative framework sufficient, or is that needing urgent overhaul? And what's your sense of government's response to those appeals and the urgency with which this is being treated?
Were you as surprised as some of us that there was nothing on this in His Majesty's speech?
Very, very surprised, but actually not in a way. We live in a corporately captured economy, basically, where big business is controlling our democracy, has huge power and influence over our elections, and that is why we are where we are. And I feel that it's completely unsustainable. While we are talking about net zero and sustainability, how can an economy run by multinational corporations who are not accountable to anybody, how can we run a democracy in that kind of an economy? You know, it's just not possible. And in fact, net zero should mean net zero for multinational power and arrogance and abuse of power, really. That should be reduced, and they should be made accountable.
Just finally, I did mention a different architecture in France, because that's been brought to my attention by auditors who can't break into this market because it is cornered by in the way that you've described. Are there other examples where we don't have the Carillions and BHSs collapsing with regularity as we have since 2016 to the current day? Are there better ways to arrange your auditing and insolvency practices?
Well, you gave the example of France earlier, and that is, the joint audits is a good example. I really think that the broader issue is we've just allowed too much power to big business in this country. And
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Anthony Higginbotham.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Steinberg, can I come to you? Because it looks like you're an expert in restructuring and insolvency.
Yeah.
For most people looking in, including constituents that I've got, and I'm sure everyone's got, who worked for Wilko, once the insolvency and administration process starts, it feels like things go into a black hole. And lots of people don't know what's going on. Workers don't know whether their jobs are secure. So I wonder if we can start by you just explaining the process from when an insolvency process starts, what happens, who does what, who's responsible for communicating.
Sure, of course, yeah. I mean, there are different types of insolvency proceeding, and the type of insolvency proceeding that a company selects is largely driven by what they want to achieve next. So in the case of administration, for example, the primary objective is to try and rescue the company as a going concern. However, there's then a cascade of subsidiary objectives. So if the administrators conclude they can't achieve the rescue of the company as a going concern, the survival of the company, then there are a sort of shopping list, if you like, of subsidiary achievements, one of which is to achieve a better outcome for the creditors than would be the case in a liquidation, try and get a distribution to the preferential creditors, if that's possible. So they will quickly make a decision as office holders as to which of those objectives they think is realistically achievable. They've usually reached that conclusion before they get appointed, particularly if they've been involved with the management before they're appointed, which they usually are. Having concluded what their objective should be, the one they should pursue, then they get about pursuing it. Now, depending on the nature of the business, they may have to move very quickly indeed. So, for example, if they want to achieve a sale of the business as a going concern, then they need to move very quickly. Because in order for the company to be sold as a going concern, it needs to continue as a going concern within administration whilst that sale is being concluded. That needs money, that needs cash, because obviously if they don't have the cash available, they can't pay the employees, they can't pay the creditors, the suppliers who they're contracting with. So they have to move very quickly. And I think a lot of the criticism about lack of information is because actually they're focusing, to be fair to the office holders, they're focusing on trying to get the business sold as a going concern rather than spraying out loads of information to creditors.
You don't think there's a transparency problem, it's a necessity of acting?
I think it's a necessity problem, to be honest, yes. I mean, they do have to prepare reports and they do have to prepare proposals, and those will get sent out. But of course, if you're a supplier who's not been paid, or if you're an employee who doesn't know whether they're going to be employed next week, those types of statutory reports are too slow for them. So they will be relying upon daily interactions, such as they are, with the office holders and their staff about what the office holders are trying to achieve. In my experience, they're normally pretty good about that, but obviously it just depends on the size of the business. it's difficult in practice to go around and consult with employees in lots of, in the case of Wilko, for example, 400 different locations. So I think it's more driven by, I don't think the office holder is trying to hide anything. I think they're usually trying to achieve a sale as a going concern. That means they have to move very quickly. There's a certain amount of confidentiality around that as well, of course.
Okay, thank you. Just Ian Lavery briefly, and then I'll come to Stephen.
Just very briefly, I was really interested to hear what Mr. Shaw was saying. I just wonder if you could say, do you think what's happened here at Wilko, because the only people that really have been affected by this are the workforce? Everybody else has went away with a considerable amount of money in their pocket. So do you see this as a systemic failure in corporate governments, or do you think it's a failure of unbridled raw capitalism?
Probably connected, the two, but it's the unique feature of Wilko is that it's an owner-managed business, right? And generally speaking, owner-managed businesses have skin in the game. And in this case, there is a long history, so there should, in theory, be that respect for the workers, as Nadine has very nicely pointed out, right? Because the workers are family. And I do a lot of research on family businesses where the workers have been treated like that and are respected because they are seen as a key part of the engine of the business. Now here we have an interesting feature where that history, of course, the business has passed through generations, and that sense of loyalty and duty has not continued somehow. And just to give you an example, when I was doing the analysis of Wilko, we find in 2017, up to 2017, the family are shown as the majority owners of the group. Then after 2017, they create another group company called Amalgamated Holdings, which is now the majority owner. So therefore, legally, it allows the family to hide behind another layer of ownership structure and minimize their liability. So here, the reaction of the owners has been, and obviously they've seen the trouble coming and they've seen the risks of that, is to protect themselves at the expense of the employees. So, and again, you got advisors all over the place kind of helping these companies do these kinds of things, and especially in the case of the audit where they have to, consultants don't necessarily have to be independent, but auditors have a duty to be independent, and as professionals, they have a duty to protect the public interest. So this is very... Thank you.
So Stephen Timms.
Can I just come in on the...
Sorry, Nadine.
So it's just this point about a family-run business, and I just think it's a really important point that absolutely our members, I would be hard-pressed to find a group of members that so consistently spoke about the fact that Wilko felt like a family and felt like a second family to them, and absolutely that loyalty, that two-way interaction. There was at the period under the previous family ownership before it became Lisa's, before she became the majority owner, was our members describe a period of good pay and conditions, feeling respected, feeling like, as you said, they had some skin in the game, they had a bit of freedom in terms of how they run their stores, they were trusted. And what happens is in that interaction is that both sides, if you like, get to thrive. There's 115 years of collective length of service sitting behind me right now with just seven Wilko colleagues. And we've spoken about the impact of all of this. The reality is that 12,000 hardworking people lost their jobs as a result of all of these catalogue of failures that, I'm sure we're going to hear more about. But really that multi-generational family that it was part of Wilko is something that I just haven't heard in any other employer that I deal with.
We'll come back to how they're feeling before Christmas, but let me just bring in Sir Stephen Timms on this question around.
Thank you. Can I come back to Mr. Sternberg? Can you just explain to us, in a situation like the Wilko situation, how is it decided how the assets that are left should be distributed amongst the various creditors, and in particular, what priority is there for making up a shortfall in the pension fund?
Sure. There's the order in which you make payments out is governed by statute. So if you are a secured creditor, if you've got fixed charge security, like a mortgage over property, for example, you have first dibs on the assets over which you have security. After that, you're looking at the administrator's fees and expenses. The unsecured creditors, and that would include a deficit on the pension scheme. They are, if you like, at the bottom of the, well, not at the bottom of the pile, shareholders are at the bottom of the pile, but there are certain creditors who rank ahead of the unsecured creditors. So there's the secured creditors, certain preferential creditors, so employees for about £800 of back pay and holiday pay. HMRC, for example, is preferred in respect of certain taxes, but not all of them. VAT principally, and national insurance contributions if they haven't been paid, and various other bits and bobs. Not corporation tax if there's any owing, but there usually isn't because there aren't any profits. And you're then into the unsecured creditors. So the pension scheme, where there is a deficit on the pension scheme, they rank as unsecured alongside the other unsecured creditors.
Do you think there's a case for promoting the pension scheme deficit in that priority list?
Well, that's a matter of policy. In some of the corporate failures, what I would say is in some of the corporate failures, that's been a very big number. Because part of the problem is when a company becomes insolvent, the way in which you calculate the deficit on the pension scheme changes and produces a sort of hyper-conservative number, which is therefore a very big number. It's a policy decision as to whether or not you should.
Can I just check with Nadine? You've written to the pensions regulator, I think, asking them to use their anti-avoidance powers to increase the resources in the pension scheme. Have you had a response from the pensions regulator on that?
Not as far as I'm aware, but clearly we're hoping as a result of their investigation that they do find that that Lisa Wilkinson does have to reimburse the pension scheme. We actually make the deficit 56 million with 20 million secured against one of the DCs, which I don't believe has been sold yet.
Thank you. Nigel, did you want to come in?
I just asked maybe Mr. Steinberg or Professor Sharp. I think when I was last guesting on this committee, we were looking at Carillion, and the problem with the auditors didn't seem to spot there was a problem, whereas here they did spot there was a problem and disclosed that the company may not be able to get past January 24. What would have happened if they'd said, no, you can't use the going concern basis of accounting, you've got to use, I think it's called break-up accounting, break-up valuation. I mean, would that have meant that they'd have had to have shown all 400 odd leases as onerous, and wouldn't you have just tipped the company straight into administration at that point?
Well, I mean, as I said to you, 4 years before, the auditors were sneakily warning that there is significant underlying risk in the future survival of the company. But I don't know how many people were reading the audit report in detail, but that's quite unusual. In the going concern paragraph, they were warning, right? So if people didn't notice that, then it's kind of their problem. But if they had written that, yes, that would mean basically that the accounts do not give a true and fair view, and the value, as a result, we do not think this is a going concern, and therefore the valuations in the balance sheet need to change. Now, as to how much the duty of the auditors is to provide the new valuations is unclear at the moment in the rules and regulations. But at least they have a duty to qualify the accounts, and they should call it a qualified opinion and say that they do not give a true and fair view. Now, as to whether this will trigger a bankruptcy or an insolvency, that's not necessarily the problem of the auditors. That's the problem of society. And in a sense, they are there as independent assessors and judges. And they ought to act with that independence, integrity, and professionalism and give a timely warning. You know, so that's my opinion.
Thank you. Anthony, finally.
Thank you, Chair. Come back to you, Mr. Steinberg. In September, the government proposed reforms of the insolvency sector. A key tenet of that was bringing full regulation to the sector. But we've also heard today that a similarly regulated sector, the audit sector, failed pretty spectacularly here. So I just want your view on the adequacy of the proposals that government made in September.
Well, I think the government's proposals, they cover a number of different areas, but on the regulatory side, as matters currently stand, the insolvency profession in the UK are, if you like, they're self-regulated. There are a number of professional bodies who regulate insolvency practitioners, and there is a kind of monitoring supervisory role for the insolvency service that sits above that, but it's fairly limited. Now, the law reforms that have been proposed, one of them was that the self-regulatory bodies, if you like, of the profession would be replaced by a single unitary regulator who would be the government, who would be the insolvency service. Now, that was in the consultation. As I understand it, in the proposals that are coming out, the legislature will reserve to itself the ability to impose that, but for the time being, I think the idea is the insolvency service will work closely with the self-regulatory bodies, the professional bodies, I think with a view, you could call it a last chance saloon, but with a view to trying to get them to up their game and improve their processes. And if they can, then the idea is that they could carry on performing it. But if they can't, then a single unitary government regulator would be imposed. Now, as to whether that's a good idea or not, in part it's about resources, okay? I mean, you can pass the law saying there's a government regulator, but in order for that to be effective, in order for that to make a difference, there would need to be resources behind that. You need to have good people working there. They would need to be on the case of these various office holders. Now, one of the related reforms, which I think will help, is that at the moment, because insolvency office holders, when they take appointments, they're personal to them as individuals. So even if they're a partner in a Big Four firm or in one of the second-tier firms, actually it's they as individuals who are appointed, not the firms. And so it is they as individuals who are regulated. Now, there is a view for some time that that's not really sufficient, because the reality is it's the firm of which they're a partner that provides all the ballast and all the resource, which is what happens in these cases. So one of the other key reforms which is being proposed is that the firms themselves should be regulated as far as their provision of insolvency services is concerned. And I think that's a good idea. Whether that makes a difference or not, I don't know. It's a sensible.
Slightly against this, Mr. Steinberg. Anything else you wanted to just...
I just wonder, so would you describe it as evolution of the current approach or revolution? And do you think that's right? Should we be more ambitious? Do we need to be more ambitious given the corporate failings we've seen before?
As far as insolvency practitioners are concerned, I think it is evolution rather than revolution, but I think that's right. Now, a lot of the criticism which Professor Shah has been directing has been at the auditing profession. And there are issues about independence and doing the both. I think the insolvency profession, my experience is actually they tend to do a pretty good job. There are, you get bad apples and you get poor instances, and they do get pulled up.
The average hourly rate is £950 an hour for PwC doing the insolvency of Wilko. I just checked the latest report. £950 an hour. A professor of accounting earns about £300 a day if they are lucky.
Mr. Steinberg, right? I just want to crystallise this, please. So your view is that evolution of the profession is, and that evolution of the regulation is required?
I think evolution is required, because I think those two, I think particularly the decision to regulate firms is a good idea. Okay. But evolution, not revolution.
Right, let me just wrap up this first panel then. Just, Patrick, was there a strategy under which Wilko could have survived and continued to be in business today?
You mean if they had taken very different decisions 9-10 years ago?
Yeah.
Yes.
Definitely. Or indeed more recently.
Yes, definitely. I think if they would have had to have started quite a while ago. They would have had to have looked at their store portfolio and start moving that. It's very difficult. We've seen a lot of retailers fail over the last 10 years, and a lot of the inertia is down to the fact that they've plugged into long leases, which then are very expensive for them to get out of. Yeah. So they stay put and hope for the best, and that's kind of what we've seen across retail over the last 10 years.
This wasn't inevitable.
No, not at all. I mean, they're in the value discount sector. That's an area all through the last 10 years of austerity that they have a real opportunity, because people are trading down from the mid-market into cheaper retailers, as they continue to do at the moment. So there was definitely an opportunity for them.
Nadine, finally, what kind of Christmas are Wilko's former workers looking forward to now?
I think ordinarily our members in Wilko would have been looking forward to working the Christmas period with their colleagues, the colleagues that they describe as a second family. I do know that some of our members have gone on to get jobs in B&M and Poundland. They've maintained similar employment. But as I said, it really is that sense of a loss of family that so many of them describe as being the real crux of the issue here. And Lisa Wilkinson hasn't even bothered to offer an acknowledgement, let alone an apology, let alone a visit to one of the stores or one of the distribution centres to say, guys, I'm sorry that it came to this. And to me, that just, I can't understand why, if you've had this family business that you've been part of for so long, that you wouldn't have the common decency to even come and give an acknowledgement to your workforce in the face of what's been one of the most difficult challenges that many of them have had to face in their lifetime.
Thank you very much to all of our witnesses. You've set the stage very well for our subsequent panels. I'm very grateful to you for your time and for the briefing work that you've done with the committee. That concludes this session. Order, order.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Four. Order, order. Welcome to this second panel of the Select Committee on Business and Trade, looking at the collapse of Wilko and the lessons for policy reform at the Department for Trade and Business. Thank you very much indeed to all of you for joining us today. That's much appreciated. We're seeking to learn the lessons from the collapse of Wilko and what that means for the programme of reform at His Majesty's Government. Ms Wilkinson, perhaps I could start with you. Could you tell the committee, did your greed bankrupt Wilko?
I don't believe so, no.
Do you want to just tell us why Wilko collapsed?
Would you like me to do that or Mark?
I would like your perspective first, please.
Okay. So, in essence, Wilko failed because we ran out of cash. That is what is that's what caused the downfall in the end. There were a lot of contributory factors that led to that over quite a long period of time, and clearly we had a strategy to deal with those factors that were hitting us, but Wilko went out of business before that strategy was fully implemented. There were a series of external factors and there were a series of internal factors, and I'm mindful that you'll want me to keep my answers short, so I need to try and do that. Externally, we're all familiar with the landscape. We had declining high streets, and Wilko is very much a high street-based stores retailer, was very much a high street-based stores retailer with long leases and high rents that kept us on those high streets. We, of course, faced the cost of business rates. We faced COVID like all businesses did, and during COVID we stayed open. We didn't furlough any team members, and I like to think that we were supportive of team members who had high risk because of medical conditions they had. We also, I think, relatively unusually paid our landlords in full throughout COVID. So the things we took advantage of were the delays in paying VAT, which we paid off, and the business rates concessions, but other than that we stayed open during COVID and covered our costs. And I think there's some debate that Mark will bring into the picture about whether we should or shouldn't have done that, but we did. We were about to enter in, we aren't a business with a history of debt, so if you look at our accounts, which are publicly available at Companies House, we don't have a history of carrying debt. And then during 2022, we were trying to move from a revolving credit facility, which we didn't use, but to a more secured debt position. We were about to enter into secured lending arrangements with Macquarie when the 2022 mini budget happened. Literally, we were in the midst of that. And at that point, the interest terms on that loan were hiked massively, and that became infeasible, and so that was a contributor externally. Financially, our revenues were falling faster than our cost base could be reduced, which was eroding cash, as you can see in the figures for 2022. We lost the confidence, sadly, of key allies. So we lost the confidence of Lloyds Bank, which had been our bank for 90 years, and they pulled away from us in 2022. We lost the confidence of the credit assurers, who pulled away from us in autumn 2022. We got some amazing support from some of our goods for resale and goods not for resale suppliers, but we didn't get support from enough of them to sustain us through that. We couldn't manage to obtain the further inward investment we needed, either by way of debt or equity, to continue to trade and implement our strategy. Our customers, and you can see this in the figures over time, have gradually reduced shopping with Wilko. Lots of people have their theories as to why. Some on my list, if you're interested, are that we failed to grow and scale our online business. The cost of living crisis clearly reduced our sales. We had big internal challenges around product availability that was caused by many internal difficulties to do with things like lorry driver shortage, distribution centre, infrastructure changes, lack of credit assurance and low supplier confidence. We had moved to a position where we had an unclear customer proposition, and I've heard some of the statements people have made as against the discounters. We're a value retailer, but our proposition was unclear against the discounters. We failed to satisfactorily address our category and product offer and move to something different and better. We had huge pressure on margin rate, spiralling costs, and I think it's been alluded to that Wilko was over-rented on the high street, and we had weak processes and infrastructure. I'm sure there are more, sir, but those are the ones in my mind.
That's a long list of failures, and the failure of that strategy has now left the taxpayer on the hook for over £40 million worth of financial support for those made redundant. We have a pension fund deficit of over £50 million, and we have creditors who are at best going to see 4p in the pound on the debts that Wilko owes to them. Do you want to just take this moment to apologise to those workers who are facing Christmas without work?
So I am thankful to so many people for so many things that they have done to help Wilko, not least amongst those the fantastic team members that have always worked at Wilko, the amazing suppliers and advisors who have supported us, and of course, top of that list has got to be the fantastic customers who shopped with us for over 90 years in our stores. I am devastated that we have let each and every one of those people down. with the insolvency that Wilko has done. I don't know how to put into words how sad I am that we have let down all our customers, all our team members, our suppliers, our advisors. Genuinely, I don't know what you want me to say, but I have always gone on record.
Sorry was the one word I was looking for, which
you
I
can
didn't
have
hear.
the word sorry. Of course, I'm sorry if you wish me to say the word sorry.
I wanted just to give you that opportunity.
No, I thought devastated covered it. I apologise. I wasn't trying to be clever. I am sorry that we are not there supporting all those people anymore.
It was a long list of problems that you identified, from the Prime Minister's budget through to the partners that you had, for example, your financial partners. What were the mistakes that you made?
What would I do differently if I had the time again? It's a question I ask myself all the time. I would do differently that year that was 2022. We started out that year not as strong as we should have done, but strong. We had positive cash, we had positive EBITDA, we had decent trading sales, we had no debt position at all at the beginning of 2022. And in each 4-week period of 2022, by trading down on our numbers, we were eroding cash. So the first thing I would like to do differently, if I could, was be more proactive on that declining sales that was dropping into cash through 2022. The next two things aren't a popularity vote, I'm afraid. I wish I had brought Mark in earlier. I think he could have made a difference if we had brought him in earlier. And I wish I had taken the advice of PricewaterhouseCoopers earlier. Those are the 3 things that I wish I had done earlier.
Mr. MacDonald.
Thank you, Chair. Well, indeed, the problems didn't start in 2022, of course. PwC had already identified issues. Just something that came out in the previous session, I just want to clear up, if I could. The last set of accounts for the year 29th of January 2022 was signed off by EY in November of 2022. Now, if the business wasn't sustainable at that point, what was the conversation going on in that interim period opposite the sale of a major asset to try to improve the situation? Was there a conversation about trying to make the picture look a little bit better with the sale of a major asset?
So, I am going to answer the question, but before I answer the question, I need to say I am not a financially qualified person. I don't come from a financial background, and to get that question answered, as I suspect you would like it answered, I would need either my CFO or a member of my finance team to do it, or the chair of my audit committee who is also financially qualified. That doesn't mean I'm not going to answer it. I am going to answer it.
Can I just check, Ms. Wilkinson, that you are a family director of the company?
I'm a family director of the company.
With the fiduciary duties that go with that?
I have the fiduciary, and of course that's why I'm going to answer the question, but I can't answer it from that financially qualified perspective. So my understanding as a director was that 2 things had to be true for us to sign off our accounts for that year end. One, we had to have sufficient cash and liquidity to ensure that we could continue to trade as a going concern. And the second one was that we had to have reasonable and achievable, sensible financial trading numbers that we were predicting we were going to deliver through 2023. We were put under enormous pressure by our then auditors, EY, to prove both of those things, that we would have adequate cash and that our numbers were reasonable and achievable. The adequate cash, as you've seen, because it's on record, was coming from either secured lending against our distribution centre in Worksop, or as it transpired, a sale and leaseback of Worksop. And secondly, through an ABL, assets-based lending, which we secured ultimately through Wilko, which was secured against many things, but principally against, from memory, stock and intellectual property, but there were other things too within that. So on the one dynamic, we needed to prove to our auditors that we had sufficient cash. The second side of it was that we had to prove that we had reasonable and achievable trading numbers that we were likely to hit as we went through the financial year, which is 23. We ran more sensitised versions of those numbers than even I can remember, to do a worst case scenario, and then an even worse case scenario, and then an even worse case scenario.
Okay, well, can I just interrupt there, because we're up against time to some degree. But according to the Sunday Times, Wilko was advised in 2022 by restructuring advisors from Teneo to use a company voluntary arrangement to close some stores and renegotiate rents on others. How did you respond to that advice?
So, my understanding, because I was not directly involved with Teneo,
But as a director?
As a director, it was reported to me at Holding Board, absolutely right. So, my understanding is that in early 2022, verbal discussions took place with Teneo about whether a creditors voluntary arrangement, a CVA, was an appropriate route for Wilko. And at that time, I understand that my CEO and my property director were told that it was not, because our financial position was not sufficiently bad to do a CVA. By September, I believe it was, of 2022, we had a long report into the Holding Board, and within that long report, as part of the contingency planning, if trading continued to deteriorate, a CVA was discussed. It was not proposed as a do-it-right-now scenario. It was proposed that if trading continued, it was a contingency plan.
Can I ask you about that? But you say it wasn't to do it right now. But wasn't it the advice from Teneo to do it right now?
No, it was not. In November, they repeated the advice around a CVA, again as a contingency for if trading continued to decline. And the consensus was we did a step plan. Step number 1 was to do the secured lending or the sale and leaseback. Step number 2 was to do the ABL. Step number 3, to be planned in the first quarter of 2023, was to consider doing a CVA, with the suggestion that we would have an implementation date of April 2023, because that would release the most cash onto the balance sheet. My understanding is you get a better business rates position if we had done it at the beginning of April. I do not know the detail of it, but that is my understanding, which is what we did. So during the first quarter of 2023, we did the planning for a CVA. We did it at that point with PricewaterhouseCoopers, not with Teneo. And there was a subtle difference. In the original report, Teneo had believed that the CVA would be largely a pension scheme voted CVA, because it had the pension deficit as a very high figure in its report. As it transpired, that was not accurate. And we were doing predominantly a landlord-voted CVA. That meant we had to do a much tighter cost reduction programme in order to try to secure the votes of the landlords in favour of that CVA. And that took us over the April date in doing that cost-cutting exercise before we could put the CVA position before the landlords. But the nub of it is, did we listen to the advice and did we follow it? Yes, we listened to the advice. Yes, we followed it.
Okay, well, that's not everybody's interpretation of those events. And I'll perhaps put to you, Ms. Wilkinson, and Mr. Jackson. The Sunday Times quoted a restructuring source as saying Wilko failed due to naivety, incompetence, a failure to listen to people who've done these things for a long time, and just stubbornness, resulting in a complete car crash and the loss of a third-generation business which could have been saved. Mr. Jackson, how accurate is that?
If that's referring specifically to the CVA, then it's inaccurate. I think...
No, it's referring to the failure of the business.
I mean, I can't comment on... I was appointed at Christmas 22, and I have to say that most of my time was spent looking forward on what needed to be done and at what pace.
You had to look back to understand what had gone wrong, so how accurate is that characterisation?
you've heard different conjecture this morning, and I would call it conjecture. The reality is, at the end of January 21, the balance sheet of the business was pretty well placed. Well placed, okay, despite views on discounting versus value retail in the right or wrong place on the high street. All of those are issues, and they all impacted the business. But there was over 100 million of cash, over 100 million of P&L reserves. They're, in my view, the biggest contributory factors to the cash outflow were, of course, the increased competition, but global supply chain issues, cost increases, failing to act on cost reduction. But most importantly, I believe that with hindsight, I would not have furloughed, or I would not have stayed open. I would have taken advantage, protected the business on the furlough scheme and rents, like 90% of other retailers. There was a warehouse management system implementation that was nothing short of a disaster that led to a shortage of availability in store stock. Therefore,
Project Optimus, is it?
Yes. Project Optimus is a wider project that included spending £60 million on bringing warehouses up to scratch. So you can quickly see COVID impact of not furloughing, yes, stayed open and traded, but cash was going out the door. The DC sale and leaseback became necessary, as did the ABL. The ABL gave us a window. When I came in, a sufficient window. It required a lot of things to be done quickly. But we took 90 million of costs out on an annualised basis. We planned very detailed a CVA with CBRE, who are the same people that Teneo would have used. There wasn't a change in strategy around the CVA. That fundamentally underpinned. So the 90 million of cost out of the structure, then 35 to 40 through a CVA, but most importantly, we had to get suppliers back on board. A large number of them had restricted credit or were on stop. If you read the press, then most of the sales shortfall in the last 2 years was driven by poor availability. It's poor availability because they didn't have the cash to pay the suppliers. So going through the ABL, taking all of the suppliers through the cost reduction programme, showing the window, showing that there was a planned CVA, it still required funding post-CVA. Actually, that turnaround plan could have been delivered. Actually, the biggest single factor in it not being delivered was news of the CVA leaking into the press, which made suppliers who we'd got back on board very nervous again, and availability started to fall, and then it became a vicious circle.
Ms Wilkinson, do you recognise that characterisation? And in addition, some informed observers felt that with a cost of living crisis and shoppers looking for bargains, this should have been Wilko's time to shine, as it's been described. Do you recognise that and the characterisation of others?
I recognise Mark's characterisation. I'm sorry, I forgot what your characterisation was in the first place.
Well, it was simply that the naivety and incompetence and failure to listen to people who had done these things for a long time, and stubbornness, resulting in a complete car crash and the loss of a third-generation business, which could have been saved. That's the charge that's put to you.
Well, I don't recognise not listening, no. I do recognise the devastation in losing a third-generation business. It is devastating. I don't know what you want me to say. You know, I do believe Wilko could have been saved, but it was not.
Mr. Gullis.
Thank you very much, Chair. Ms Wilkinson, I'm just a bit baffled because you've talked about 2022 a lot, and of course I totally accept that there were economic impacts external to the business that have impacted. But we heard from, I'm pretty sure it's Professor Shah, if not I apologise for the other panellists, pointed out in the first panel that in the audit accounts of 2018-19, the last sentence of the going concern section, the financial viability of the business was in question. So why was that not acted upon, and why is it all the blame is being put on 2022? I feel a sleight of hand here. It's easy to point fingers at the government, it's easy to talk about COVID, it's easy to talk about cost of living. The reality is you had the warning signs in the last sentence. Was it simply the case that you and the directors didn't read the audit report?
I don't know how to answer that question. We did read the audit report. We are taken through the audit report by our auditors in holding board meetings. Whichever auditors we have, we go through that and we always scrutinise it. It is true that the trading position of Wilko's in terms of turnover was weakening over the years. I think we always scrutinised and took steps to address everything we could. We had relatively, not as strong trading performance, but we had relatively strong trading performance until we hit financial year 2022. So we're still in 2021, we're still taking 1.36 billion turnover. We've got EBITDA of 48.3 million. We've got net assets of 118.4 million. We're still in a relatively good position by the end of 2021. It is during 2022 that position declines.
The truth is, though, the warning signs were written in 2018 and action wasn't taken until 2022. So there's a 4-year period of inaction in essence, in my opinion. And Mr. McDonald earlier, who's no longer in his place, was just raising about the fact that you've been sort of warned about maybe looking at some of the high street shops and renegotiating the leases. And you said that the advice wasn't sort of told to do it now, it was just given to you. Well, when my partner tells me to put the rubbish out and I ignore it the first time, and then she tells me to put it out a second time, that means do it now. So I'm a bit confused when the business has repeated its advice twice, that's not been taken as a bit of a hint, at the very least, that you need to do something.
I'm sorry if I gave you the impression we weren't doing anything about the fact that we were over-rented and that our stores were in the wrong place. Of course we were. That was a active stream of work for as long as I can remember in reducing our lease obligations, and I would have to bring the relevant head in to enable you to have the detail. I just don't have the detail on that today. So I'm sorry, I thought you were referring to the more aggressive approach through the CVA mechanic. But yes, we had been working for many years to reduce our rent bill and to reduce the length of our leases and to get our stores into the right places. It was an ongoing job of work.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Jackson, was it your view that the Teneo advice was inaccurate?
I think we have to separate out. Was a CVA inaccurate? No. A CVA would have put the business in a much better position, but a CVA is an insolvency process. It's an insolvency process that requires funding on the other side, otherwise you won't get through it. Their analysis was incorrect. Their analysis, 75% of people who vote by value have to vote in favour for it to go through. Their analysis of voting had a pension scheme that could put it through on its own, and no other creditors mattered. The reality is that wasn't true, and all landlords needed to be taken through, all suppliers did. So the planning detail behind a successful CVA was not the same as what Teneo had proposed.
Does that mean that, in your judgment, it couldn't be implemented?
No, it could have been implemented.
It could have been implemented.
But it couldn't have been implemented until you've got funding and you are insolvent. So it couldn't have been implemented when they recommended, which was back end of 22.
It could.
It couldn't have been done at the time. It was a deferred recommendation. It wasn't to do it now. Absolutely not. It couldn't. That's just impossible. You have to be insolvent to do a CVA. The business was not insolvent. It had a declining cash base. It had freehold property of £80 million in value. It wouldn't have been possible until all of those plans have been worked through.
Was there a way, therefore, to pursue that reform?
I believe so. Again, all of this is with hindsight. We had a window if we could have got suppliers on board. We then went to with the detailed CVA plans, we went to at least 20 potential investors, both private equity and debt, and actually looking at full sale of the business. You had to get funding secured throughout the CVA process, because suppliers will say, oh, hang on, am I going to get paid only when I know that we got through this? And then you need funding the other side. That funding required a detailed plan, and we had funding agreed the other side, but the funding up front still required, we had an ABL agreed with Wilko. Wilko didn't want to be in the long term, so we had to get the two parties to work together. As time ran on, the lack of availability of stock in store made the position worse each day, but there was definitely a window where the turnaround could have been done. And actually the difference in funding that we could raise and the funding that was required is quite a bit less than the cost to the taxpayer.
Why was that opportunity not seized if there was a window of opportunity?
Because we couldn't get the funders to back it.
So it was an external constraint rather than a decision of the business?
Yes, absolutely. It was pursued. I knocked down an awful lot of doors more than once, and we had interested parties right up to the beginning of August who were really keen to save the business, and I thought still a very good chance of doing so.
And what was stopping these creditors?
Ultimately, the amount of security in the balance sheet was falling every day. So the amount that people who were secured lenders were prepared to lend was also reducing. The climate that we are in, the UK economic climate, particularly for retail, with future cost increases, the investment community were not overly keen. So I could get about 15 million unsecured, and I could get 40 to 45 of secured lending, bringing a total of around 60, 65 maybe. 75 to 90 was the need.
You see our problem. Our problem is that in 2021, you've got 108 million in cash on the balance sheet. We've got a deterioration in trading conditions, but that affects every business on the high street. Other players seem to have been able to weather the storm, and you did not. So we're trying to understand why you didn't when others did, when you started with such a strong cash position.
I wasn't in the midst of the decision making, but if you can imagine paying rents, which I think are £90 million a year, not furloughing people, and spending 60 million on 2 warehouses, the impact of credit insurance being pulled, accelerating cash out to suppliers, that can happen quite quickly.
But those are all examples of management failure.
I wasn't there at the time, so I can't comment on the decisions
Ms.
and
Wilkinson,
the reasons why they were made.
You were there at the time, so why were those decisions taken?
So there are many decisions that Mark talked about. Which ones do you want me to focus on?
Well, let's go through all of them. So let's go through the furlough, let's go through the failure of Project Optimus. Let's start with those two.
So we took a decision to stay open. The history of Wilko is that it has always stayed open. It stayed open throughout World War II. It's always stayed open when challenges happen. We were an essential retailer. We debated at great length as a board whether we should stay open, and the decision we took was to stay open, to not furlough our team members, to support those who were medically vulnerable, and to pay our landlords in full. That is the decision we took.
And the warehouse project?
We have had 2 warehouses, DC1 and DC2. One is in Magor in Wales, one is in Worksop. The warehouse project was taken. There were 2 forms to the warehouse project. There was warehouse management system implementation across both distribution centres, and there was a relay of the racking and the layout of both distribution centres. That was taken many years ago, the decision to implement, and then was a phased programme that started with Magor, which was the smaller of the two distribution centres. So it was an implementation of warehouse management system and of relay of racking, and then that moved on to distribution centre 1. Clearly, it was done with the intention to improve at the processes in our warehouse. We had out-of-date machinery. It was very manual. We weren't as efficient as we could be, and a decision was taken by the board collectively as a capital investment to do that work.
So, Ms. Venning, what advice did you give to the business about the Teneo advice?
Well, firstly, thank you to the committee for inviting us here today to talk about our role as auditors of Wilko and indeed on audit reform as well. We have listened quite carefully to the last panel and do welcome the opportunity to offer some corrections and to answer your questions. Turning to your specific question, Chair, it's not our role as auditors to offer advice to the company. The company will make management decisions. They are involved in the day-to-day running of the business. Our role as auditors is to assess the status of the business, the position of the business, and to come up with an independent view, an independent opinion as to whether the accounts as presented by management and signed off by the directors are indeed true and fair, and provide the users with an appropriate view in terms of the position that the company's in.
At no stage did you give advice about whether to pursue the kinds of ideas that were in the Teneo proposal?
It wasn't appropriate for us to do that in the role. As auditors, we wouldn't give advice on that. It's very important that we are independent.
Is that a no? Did you give advice on whether to pursue the Teneo proposal, yes or no?
It wasn't our role to do so.
Is that a no?
It's a no.
Okay, thank you. What advice did you give the business about the steps that it might need to take in order to remain a going concern, for example, around the sale of the warehouse?
So again, it's not our position as auditors to offer advice to the business. It would be highly inappropriate for us to do so. We are an independent body that assesses the decisions that management make in terms of how they feed themselves through into the accounts to be sure that they are true and fair. In terms of the assessment that we went through from a going concern perspective, I think it's very important actually for the committee to understand, and hopefully it's helpful for us to jump to what our opinion actually said in terms of our view, in terms of the position of the business. So if you wouldn't mind just for 2 minutes for me just to read out the very specific piece in our opinion. Yeah. I think it really is quite important actually, Chair, for the whole committee to understand the specific words that we said in our opinion, because I do think it frames the rest of the discussion that we'll have here today. So in our opinion, it says very clearly under the heading of material uncertainty related to going concern, it says at the date of approval of these financial statements, the group had insufficient committed financing in place to withstand a severe but plausible downturn in conditions, a severe but plausible downturn in trading activity through the going concern period to January 2024. These events and conditions indicate that a material uncertainty exists that may cast significant doubt on the group and company's ability to continue as a going concern. So, to the point that Mr. Shah raised in the first panel, this was not hidden away. This was not loose language. This was very, very clear language in our audit opinion that brought serious attention to the situation that the business found itself in, and drew the attention of the users to the fact that there was a plausible scenario whereby the company could run out of cash if sufficient financing wasn't raised.
So did you, before you published that judgment, did you warn Wilko's management that there was a risk that they were not going to meet the going concern test?
Yeah, so as part of our audit, we do a lot of work in terms of challenging management around the forecasts that they prepare. It's important for the committee to understand that the preparation of the forecasts are management's responsibility. Our role as auditors is to challenge those, to challenge all the assumptions within them. So our audit for the January 2022 year end started in May of 2022. and we obtained those forecasts that management had prepared and set about assessing whether the assumptions within them were appropriate. We do that in a number of ways. So we do that by looking back at the historical accuracy of management's forecasting. We look at what industry predictions are saying around the business and around the sector, and we use our own understanding of the business and indeed involve our internal retail specialists to help us with that. And when we did all of that work, we concluded that the forecasts that management had prepared at the time were optimistic, and we challenged management to go away and revise those forecasts to take account of some of the challenges that we'd raised in relation to the assumptions. That process went on for a number of months. It was an iterative process where we continued to challenge management around the forecasting that they had presented to us. We ended up with 4 different versions of the forecasts and found ourselves in September with a sort of final position that had been put forward by management, which we still considered could be even more severe. So they went away diligently and prepared a final forecast for us, which in our view took account of the sort of severe but plausible downside that could be experienced in the business. And only at that point, actually, were we prepared to sign our opinion to conclude that the financial statements that the directors had prepared were true and fair.
And that last scenario entailed the sale of the warehouse?
The last scenario included the sale of the warehouse because that had happened in November before we signed off.
I think what we're struggling to understand is how you've got a set of accounts which are obviously bleeding cash pretty quickly at this stage. We've got some of the challenges around getting further agreements with creditors on board, and the accounts are basically being plugged with a one-off sale of a warehouse, and yet a going concern judgment is given.
So I come back to the fact that the going concern assessment, that is a basis of preparation of accounts that is dictated within the accounting standards. Our audit opinion drew a serious warning flag to the users of the accounts around the risks that were very plausible risks in the business. When we signed the accounts, there was £58 million worth of cash in the business. Part of that was from the sale and leaseback, but equally part of that was part of the receipts from the sale and leaseback went to repay the RCF. So, you know, we got to a place where we were comfortable that the audit opinion that we signed, and we still stand by today, was the right opinion because it drew the user's attention to the serious warning flag. Just to the comment that Mr. Shah made earlier.
Bust and you signed off the accounts and you stand by that judgment? That's an extraordinary conclusion.
We don't sign off the accounts. The directors sign off the accounts. We sign an audit opinion.
You signed it off as a going concern.
The directors sign the accounts as a going concern. We offer an opinion in relation to whether that set of accounts is true and fair. And in terms of the various other options that were available to us that Professor Shah mentioned earlier, the other options we had in terms of signing our opinion could have entailed, firstly, a clean opinion with no reference to any warning signs in the business at all, or it could have been a disclaimed opinion, and we issue a disclaimed opinion if we don't have access to the books and records sufficient to be able to make our judgment, or the third option would be an adverse opinion, which was the one that Professor Shah was alluding to. That opinion would have only been relevant in one of 3 situations. Firstly, the company had already taken the decision to put the business into liquidation. Secondly, the directors had already taken the decision to cease trade in the business, or the third option would have been that the directors had no realistic alternative other than to do so. So that is the criteria that we were assessing at the date of our sign-off. And to have concluded with an adverse opinion at that point would have been a very extreme view. There were realistic alternatives for the business. You've heard today from management and also from the previous panel that this was not inevitable. There were options that the business was pursuing. There were financing options. There were a number of cost-cutting initiatives that were already in train, as well as growth opportunities. So for us to give that opinion would have been the wrong answer, so we stand by the opinion that we gave.
Okay, so Ms Wilkinson, what advice did you receive from EY about the decisions that you needed to take in order to keep the business as a going concern?
We didn't take advice from EY. EY were our auditors, not our advisors. We took advice from Teneo and from PricewaterhouseCoopers in 22-23.
Your point of view?
I mean, I again go back to Christmas 22. I joined. I am aware of the Teneo report, and I'm aware that PwC were appointed subsequent to Teneo. And yes, therefore, we're providing advice.
And can I add, we did do as we were advised and pursue a CVA in the first quarter of 2023. The implementation date was pushed back further than April because we needed to do the cost cutting and to secure the support of the landlords. But that CVA advice was followed. It wasn't ignored. It was always intended that it was a contingency if trading continued to deteriorate, with planning in the first quarter of 23 and implementation from April. We did it later for the reasons I've given, but I don't know how else to put it, was not ignored.
I think you said earlier that you wish you'd done it earlier.
We couldn't have done the CVA earlier. What I'd like to have done earlier was scrutinise those trading figures earlier.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm just wondering, just going back to Svening's point about the discussions that you did have with Wilko at the time. What was the sort of tone of the discussions that you had? Because that's, I mean, you've laid out, you know, the number of steps that you've suggested, and without response. But you know, was there a feeling of rejection of what you were putting forward, or was it, you know, how difficult were these discussions that you were having with the board of Wilko or the financial director at the time?
It's not unusual for directors to be optimistic about their business. Our role is to challenge those forecasts and to challenge the assumptions within it.
How was that challenge responded to?
Yeah, so as I said, it started in May. The directors were open to the challenge. They were receptive and responsive. They went away and revised the forecasts, as I said, a number of times in response to our challenges, and indeed as the trading activity panned out over the course of the year. This went on for a number of months. So they were entirely professional and responsive to our challenge.
Do you think that you said before just about the fact that you've in your reports that you've suggested that the company is a going concern. But looking back now, I mean, is there a point or a thought that goes through your head, and from your sort of director of audit as well, is there a thought that goes through your head that you should have been given a contrary opinion at that point based on the information that you have, how things have played out in the intervening period?
Yeah, look, I have every sympathy for all the individuals at Wilko who have lost their jobs, and clearly when there's a corporate collapse, it is time for reflection. We have thought long and hard since the news of Wilko's collapse about whether we would have done anything differently. When we've done that, we've gone back to all of the steps that we did take, the challenge that we posed to management, the robustness with which we did our work, and the opinion that we got to was the right opinion, and we stand by that opinion.
Right. And is there a review process within your company to allow you to do that within the audit team and reflect on your audit fee and so on, how much you've...
Yeah, may I add to that? Yes, absolutely. I mean, one of the critical things is that we've introduced as a lesson learned from previous corporate failings is the need for broader consultation internally to make sure that the partner signing the opinion feels both supported and challenged in the decisions that they're making. And one of the critical things in this situation is to make sure that the distinction between whether to sign an opinion with a material uncertainty, as we did, or to sign an adverse opinion, which would undoubtedly have resulted in the earlier wind-up of the company, that public interest is taken into account in that decision making.
And was that part of the discussions that you had with Wilko at the time to say there will be an adverse opinion that we might have to give here unless you take the action that's that is required to actually make the company long-term solvent and sustainable?
The discussion that was had at the time was around the understanding of these realistic alternatives. Realistic alternatives other than for the company to collapse. And they included the ongoing discussions that they were in with lenders, the ongoing cost-cutting exercises that they were involved in, and the growth opportunities that they were exploring. As soon as we knew that they were realistic opportunities and alternatives to collapse, then it was very clear to us that an adverse opinion would have been the wrong answer.
And the final question would be, just when you took over the audit responsibilities from PwC, was anything at that point red flagged from the previous auditor to suggest that, you know, this is a company that you needed to take especially careful consideration of, given the previous history and the fact that the whole market and the declining sort of footfall for the company was on the down? Was it something that you were concerned about as an auditor, that you thought, well, you know, we need to put in almost like a good team here or a special measures team to make sure that the company is protected, or that you can give the best advice possible?
There were no red flags raised to us by PwC when we took on the audit. We go through a very careful process of client acceptance, as you would expect, and we assess the financial health of the business as well as the directors that are involved at the time. And when we went through that, we didn't have any concern around taking on Wilko as an audit client.
Lavery.
Thanks. Ms Wilkinson, you mentioned before that, and you know, under your guidance, the company Wilko was a really friendly company. The workforce felt part of a family, and everybody respected each other. I wonder if the workforce actually think that now, as a result of what has happened, because at the same time as everybody was part of this huge welcoming, embracing family, the Wilkinson family creamed off nearly £150 million in dividends over a period of 20 years. And that includes £3.75 million in the year preceding the collapse of Wilko. Now, the question would be, of course, is if that amount of profit has been made, the family's creamed it off, and then you look at the 12,000 people who lost their jobs through the closure of 400 plus stores, the had their livelihood taken away from them. And not only that, the potential for financial security in terms of a pension scheme is in jeopardy as well. Why on earth did this family-friendly company with 12,000 dedicated workers, why did they decide not to invest more in the company? And indeed, why did they not put any finances, any of the profits which you creamed off for your family, into the pension scheme, which I think is being suggested this morning? The estimated pension scheme now is a deficit of £76 million on a buyout basis.
There's a lot in there. Yes, the team members in Wilko did feel like one big family, and I am sure that as between themselves...
You think they feel like that now?
As between themselves, I'm sure they still do. I'm sure I am no longer included in that family, but I am sure that as between themselves they still do, and I'm very proud of them for feeling that way. They're an amazing group of people. I've not worked in many businesses, but I've always been proud to be part of the team members in Wilko, and will continue to thank them for everything they did in trying to save it. Should we do pension deficit? So the pension deficit that is visible to the directors is the deficit that is on a going concern basis. This was our understanding of the numbers. So when in the last couple of years, so in financial year ending 2022, we understood the deficit to be minus 12.2 million, and in financial year 2023, we understood the deficit to be 7.4 million, respectively, those dates. In both of those years, we made pension contributions in financial year 2022 of 8.4 million, and in financial year 23, again, 8.4 million. So the director's belief at the time was that the group retirement benefit scheme was being funded with a view to it in a short period of time not having a deficit at all. In addition to that, towards the tail end of 2022, we agreed that there would be a security for the group retirement benefit scheme over our second distribution centre in Magor. I believe that equated to about £20 million. So if you were sitting in the boardroom of Wilko at that point, you would have believed that the deficit was 12.2 and then 7.4, so going down, and that you were paying in 2 lots of 8.4 plus a security of 20 million. I'm not suggesting that we were being smug about it. We were still focusing on the pension, but were we focusing on the pension and doing our best to ensure that that pension was covered? We were. I don't understand myself, I apologise for not being finance, where the new pension deficit number comes from, but I believe it is valued on a different basis because we are no longer in business. So it's valued on a discontinuance basis, which gives us a higher deficit. But the figure that you talk about is not the figure that I would have recognised when I was sitting in the boardroom and when we collectively were making decisions around pension contributions and pension deficit. Now, I can give you the pension deficit and the contributions for the 9-year period if you would like them, but I'm trying to keep it.
I think the point Mr. Lavery is really underlining is that you were taking dividends out of a business that was failing, that had a pension deficit.
Okay.
How can that be justified?
So the easiest way I can explain the dividend is, yes, there was a return made to shareholders by way of dividend. My understanding is that is...
When you say shareholders, you mean you?
So I did not receive any dividends in my personal capacity.
Mm-hmm.
There were no dividends paid to individual people. I was not a shareholder in my personal capacity.
The dividends presumably went to the holding company.
The dividends went to Amalgamated Holdings Wilkinson Limited, which was put in place in, I believe, 2017.
You're a shareholder in that?
No, there are a series of family trusts who are a shareholder in that. So I genuinely am not fibbing when I say I did not hold a share in a personal capacity. Amalgamated Holdings Wilkinson Limited was put in place, contrary to what one of the earlier panels said, to give everybody visibility, because sometimes trusts in this country are viewed as being opaque. We put that vehicle in, actually not as a defence mechanic for the family, but as a means of people being able to see what went out of the Wilko Group into the family holding company, and then, if anything had been paid out of the family holding company, what came out? Nothing came out. We didn't pay anything out in those years.
Mr. Lavery.
I can cover the dividends if you would like me to.
I think we've got the information we need, thanks. The question I would just conclude on, Ms. Wilkinson, is that we've heard evidence this morning from the J&B union, which states quite clearly that you haven't once offered an apology, you haven't communicated with the staff, you haven't acknowledged that the company and how the company have ended up in the position where it is. And at the question of the chair this morning, you said you offer an apology. Will you be offering an apology? Are you sincere in an apology to the 12,000 people who you've said twice this morning are like being basically the bedrock of your company? Why have you not apologised until this morning?
I'm not sure I'm allowed to say this, but before
You're under parliamentary privilege, you can say what you like.
Before Wilko went into administration, or actually it might have been shortly after, I might have got my timing right, I asked to do an announcement to all team members to thank them and to say all of the things that you have said, but the advice from the directors and from the administrators was that I should not do that. Subsequently, of course, I've responded to anybody who messaged me, and I'm not difficult to get hold of. And in addition, I'm a very private person who doesn't do interviews to the press, but I did an interview with Oliver Shah at the Times in order to say thank you to my team members. And he asked me what the one thing I wanted to get out was, And it was to thank my team members and my customers and my suppliers for everything they had done. And that is the only reason I did that interview. And yes, you can say it's not an appropriate newspaper for doing that in. I agree, it's not. It's not necessarily my team members and my customers' first newspaper of choice. But it was the only means I had of getting a thank you out to my team members. You today, thank you, have given me another opportunity to thank my team members and my customers. I will be thanking my team members and my customers to my dying day. You will never find me saying anything else. I appreciate each and every one of them, and I echo your words. They were the bedrock of Wilko.
Let me just wrap up this point with a question about the profitability between 2019 and 2022. The profits for that period of time was £11.6 million. The dividends that were paid out over that time was £7.5 million. That's two-thirds. Two-thirds of the profits of a company that was in trouble were paid out in dividends. How on earth can that be justified?
So I'm sorry, off the top of my head, I don't recognise that time period. I'm not disputing it at all, but I don't recognise the time period. In the 9 years since the demerger, we have taken out the shareholders have had about £15 million worth of dividends, which is about 1.7 million per year. Each of those dividends would have followed the correct corporate governance. They would have been recommended by the CFO as prudent. They would have gone through the boards of directors. We would only have paid those dividends if we had either the right profit in year or reserved profits, and I don't believe that they fell below 100 million, and we had cash to do that. We also, over that 9-year period, invested 273 million in the business and 36 million in the pension scheme. I hear you when you say we took 15 million.
Let me just go through it.
2019
profit 32.6. 2020, 11.4, 2021, 4.4, 2022, 36.8. Dividends over that period, 1.5, 1.5, 2.25, 2.25. That's £11.6 million in profit and £7.5 million in dividends. That is 65% of the profit between 2019 and 2022 was paid out in dividends from a business that was in trouble. And what is especially stark is that as the business plunged into deeper trouble, the dividends went up. How can that be justified?
My understanding is that the directors looked at the EBITDA figures and the reserves and cash, and that was the dividend that was recommended.
But it looks to us, just on the numbers, like you're burgling a failing business.
I can't answer the question in any other way. That is my understanding of how dividend is arrived at.
Stephen Timms.
Thank you. Wilkinson family is among the wealthiest families in the country, thanks to the Wilko business over 90 years. As things stand, there's a £50 million hole in the Wilko pension fund. Shouldn't the family be making good that hole so that at least the full pensions owed to people are paid?
I don't recognise that statement that we are one of the wealthiest families in the country, and I don't have assets to fill a £50 million hole in a pension scheme. I don't.
Can I ask, you explained to us that the dividends that were paid went into the holding company rather than to individuals, but
yes.
But I mean, what happened to them? Is it still sitting in that holding company? What became of it?
Dividends from 2017 were paid into AHWL. They are sitting in AHWL. They are invested in start-up businesses, UK properties, and a limited amount of stock market investments.
So are there not resources there that can be used to fill the pension hole?
No, they are not. They are tied up in other things, and my understanding is, as a director of AHWL, I have legal obligations to act in the best interests of AHWL, having taken into account its stakeholders, and those do not include the group retirement benefits.
We heard
certainly wouldn't add up to anything like that figure, because as we've pointed out, since 2017, there's not been anything like that money come out of the business in order to do that. You can see it at Companies House. The assets that Amalgamated Holdings Wilkinson Limited has are fully visible at Companies House. It's why we put the vehicle there in the first place, so people could see.
We're told that the family has received nearly 150 million in dividends from Wilko, admittedly over 20 years. There surely must be some resources there that could be applied to.
Do I have time, sir, to cover the dividends?
I'm sorry.
Do I have time to cover the dividends? Because I can't do a pithy one-liner on the dividend.
No, that's fine. We're quite interested in how so much money has come out, leaving a great big deficit, which now somehow can't be filled because you've got fiduciary duties to the company that it was siphoned into.
So, since April 2014, and there's a reason I'm taking these dates, I'm not trying to be tricky, but since 2014, which is since the remaining shareholders, the shareholders that retain the business have been in the business, the total dividends have been 15.6 million, which is an average, I hear, sir, the figures, but an average of 1.7 per annum. The P&L reserves and assets were well over 100 million. We didn't carry any debt. The cash at the year end has averaged 77 million over that period, with a low of 58 and a high of 108. The pension contributions were 36.5 million, and investment decisions which are made prior to dividend decisions, as per the cash flow statements, we invested 273 million. So that is the period from 2014. The 2014 63 million dividend in specie was what is called a demerger, which in my terms is, instead of pushing businesses together, you're splitting them apart. And that secured the exit of shareholders who wished to leave the business. The easiest way to think about it is that consideration, that 63 million was consideration for their shares. So those shareholders who wished to exited the business, taking the 63 million. The remaining shareholders, the ones that stayed behind, received no dividend that year. So that is where the 63 million comes in. My understanding prior to 2014, and we're going back a period of time now, but my understanding prior to 2014 is that the dividends were higher, reflecting a more profitable business and a higher number of shareholders. Much of the funds in that period were used by the shareholders who were to remain in 2014 to do the initial buyout stages for the shareholders who were ultimately to leave on the demerger in 2014. That is how the figures break down.
Notwithstanding that buyout, that would still leave 100 million in dividends.
I'm sorry, sir?
That would still leave 100 million in dividends. So our understanding is that about 180 million has been removed. About 80 million of that was relating to the buyout that was recorded in the 2015 accounts. That would still leave about 100 million that has come out of the business between 2003 and 2022. That then leaves us with a pension fund that is still short, and 100 million dividends that has come out, and we're asking, why can't the dividends that have come out be used to fund the pension fund deficit?
I don't recognise those numbers. I'm happy to share that.
They're from your accounts.
Yes, I don't recognise them. I'm happy to share what they are. I'm happy to go back, dig through, and share what they are. I'm not trying to be difficult about it. The dividends that the remaining shareholders had out prior to the 2014 demerger date largely went into the early stage transactions of buying out the shareholders who exited in 2014. So the dividends that the remaining shareholders have are the dividends that have been paid since 2014, which over that period was, I think it was the 15.6 million. So Sir, I can't answer the questions as to the others because we do not have it. The remaining shareholders do not have that money.
Where's it gone?
In buying out the shareholders who have left.
But there's 100 million in dividends that have gone into whatever the holding company is, over and above the 80 million that was gone to consolidate your control.
No, there is not. There is not. So the dividends that were paid before 2014,
yeah,
the departure of the exiting shareholders took place in 3 transactions. It took place in a standard share buyback, a buyback and cancellation, and then a demerger. It was in 3 phases over a series of years. Those dividends that predate 2014, that were larger amounts, those shareholders who remained used that money to buy the shares in the phase 1 and phase 2 transactions. So they did not retain that money. They had it in the first place, but they did not retain that money because that money too went, not strictly speaking, back into Wilko, but into other shareholders. So the money that the remaining shareholders have is only the money that came out from after the demerger in 2014.
And they've spent it.
So there's 2 chunks to that. There's I don't believe, sir, that it has been spent. I believe it is either sitting invested in the trusts or it is sitting invested where you can see it in Amalgamated Holdings Wilko Limited.
Any further?
Well, I wonder, those shareholders who departed, as you explained, isn't there some obligation on them to contribute towards filling this very large hole at the moment in the pension fund?
So,
given that a large amount of their wealth was derived from the business, isn't there an obligation there on them?
I am conscious that I am not them and I cannot answer for them. I'm not their spokesperson. But that was a considerable time ago. They have not been shareholders of Wilko since 2014, so for 9 years. Since 2014, the business has traded successfully for quite a considerable period of time before we hit 2022 and the situation we find ourselves in today.
Thank you very much. My questions are to both Lisa Wilkinson and Mark Jackson, and we've covered quite a bit of what I was going to ask, but let me just state this. 12,000 people made unemployed, many worked for decades, including some of my own constituents. You have anchor stores, very high reputation throughout many of the towns in this country. Rents 40% above market rate. You're a cash company and you had cash halved in 21-22, but actually you then talked about COVID, but actually you weren't doing so well in 2018 either. The GMB say in 2014 the writing was on the wall as you were moving away from being a cash retailer. In 2017 you set up Amalgamated Holdings. You talked about global supply chain, Mr. Jackson, being an issue, but if I think about walking around Home Bargains, B&M or The Range, I think of colour and lots of things on the shelves, whereas for quite some time now, if you were to go around Wilko's, you would see beige shelves, empty shelves. That's not something that's happened just in this last few years. So what could and should have been done differently in running Wilko? First of all, Ms Wilkinson, but then also, Mr Jackson, I do understand you were only there since Christmas 22. So if you had been there since, say, 2018, what would you have done in the meantime? So, Ms Wilkinson first, please.
So what should we have done?
Yes. What could you have done differently in running the company?
We should have had, exactly as you described, higher stock availability on shelf. We should, exactly as you described, taken greater steps to half of Wilko's sales were Wilko own brand products, so not branded products. So we should have taken steps to reinvent our category and product offer so it was different and better. And Kin, I believe it was referred to as Winnovate earlier, was part of our strategy to do that, to reinvent our product offer so it was different and better. We could and were have been trying to rework our stores portfolio so that our stores were not over-entered and so that they were in either the right towns, the right place in towns, on the right retail parks. Did I say already we should have gone larger on our digital offer? Did I? No. So we should have built wilko.com faster and better. We were, contrary to what has been suggested, still a value retailer. We have always been a value retailer, and value sat at the heart of the Wilko offer. But value well, in Wilko world, value has three components to it. One is price, one is experience, and one is quality. And there was never a desire to erode the experience or the quality of our product or offer for our customers. There was a great concentration on how you do that and still deliver product at great value to the customer. Could we have worked harder at that? I'm sure more energy and effort should have gone into it. I think those are my main. There is a whole load of others that I could raise, but if you're asking me to go back in time and what do I think was super important, I think those things were super important.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Jackson, do you agree? And if so, what could have been done?
Hindsight is always brilliant. I mean, I just want to go back to the sort of 1819 that keeps being brought up as a year of when everything started to go wrong. It's my understanding, and I'll caveat this with I may be wrong, but it's my understanding that this was a disastrous year over a load of foreign exchange derivatives, nothing to do with underlying trading. And a significant restructure was required to recover the business from that, which was the process that they went through. And I go back to what I said earlier, the end of January 21, the business was in decent shape with over...
It was flying.
Yeah. So I'm dismissive of everyone's comments of what the strategy should have been in 18, 19, 17 when... Yeah.
So it wasn't COVID and it wasn't global supply because it was flying.
COVID, the decision, I'm talking about the decision to stay open, not furlough and pay rents, that was a big drain of cash. In the earlier COVID periods, that was fine. The 60 million of warehouse spent. What would I have done differently? It is, who knows? But the second I went in, I accepted that with the trading environment that existed, with the availability, cost out was the first action. Took 90 million of costs out on an annualised basis. Property was still over-rented and kicked off detailed planning on CVA.
Yes. Were you shocked when you arrived?
Well, I knew what I was coming into. So I came in knowing that the business was in, I'll call it distress, and that there was a window of opportunity to turn it around. And I still think it was a decent opportunity. A number of things went against us. I still think this business should exist, and I think somebody should have invested in it.
You just ran out of time, is that what you think?
Run out of the sufficient liquidity to get suppliers back on board, to get the stock on the shelves, would have given us a bigger window. And it's very investable. The management team, there's a new management team, went round to 20 sort of private equity type of investors as well as debt providers, and we got very close.
Right. Thank you.
What was the point about the forex derivatives, please?
I think that's when there was a big loss in 2018-19, which was referred to, and I have to say it's conjecture, as the start of Wilko's problems. Was it bought all of its Far East product in US dollars. It took out forward rate contracts to fix the price it was buying at, and it made an enormous mistake. And there was, I believe, a loss in the region of £40 million on the FX derivatives.
In that year, yes. I can't give you the full detail on it, sir. I'm sorry, I could outside here, but I'd have to remind myself. But yes, that was the year of the FX issues.
Just one question. Mr. Jackson, you've mentioned a couple of times just about the lack of action taken over furlough, and if the company had maybe decided to take that as an option. And Ms. Wilkinson, you said that under no circumstances would you allow that to have happened or stores to close during that period. But I just wondered if that was
It was not under no circumstances. We took a decision not to.
Not to, right. But did you? What kind of advice did you take at that time from your accountants and financial advisors to say, if you even did furlough on a looked at your least profitable stores, for example, or the most problematic stores, if furlough had been committed to at that point, what sort of information did you have that allowed you to come to that decision based on the finances?
Sorry, I'm interrupting. I'd need a CFO here to remind me of what the modelling was we did. We did a load of modelling around what would happen if we did or didn't. But in the end, a decision was taken by the boards to remain open. It was felt to be the right thing for customers. It was felt to be the right thing for team members. It was not a decision that was it was not a unanimous decision, so there were directors who had to disagree and commit rather than, so it was by no means an easy or ill thought through decision. There was a lot of discussion around it.
A figure that was bandied around at the time, how much?
I cannot. And we were largely in uncharted territory, remember, on the furloughing and COVID, but we did.
A lot of companies were in the same territory, and they made what might be seen as the right call.
We just finally bring in Mr. Mills.
Ms. Wilkinson, I just want to go back to the questions about your amalgamated holdings, Wilkinson Limited. I think the last balance sheet I could see, it had 16 million of net assets, of which 9 million were listed investments. And you said there were some stakeholders' interest that prevented you offering that up as sort of compensation for those who've lost in the administration. Well, which stakeholders?
So my understanding is, as a director of AHWL, myself and my co-director have a duty to act bona fide in the best interest of that company. That is my understanding.
But usually you have to act in the interests of your creditors or your shareholders, which are you, and there really weren't many creditors of that company. I mean, were you never tempted when the crisis hit and you got 9 million of listed investments to realise them and tip them in the company and try and save it?
Oh, that debate we had, yes. Was there anything we could or should do to invest in Wilko? We didn't have sufficient funds to make a difference to Wilko.
Just out of interest, how much is sitting in the family trust? Is that tens of millions or is...
No, it is a small number of properties because we tried in... If you remember in 2017, there was a whole load of adverse publicity about not being able to have visibility of private limited companies' shareholders' assets. And our response to that was to put in a vehicle that gave visibility. So insofar as we could, we got all of the assets from the trusts into the limited companies so that everybody could see it. And the ones that are difficult to get into the limited company so you can see them are property assets because, of course, that incurs stamp duty, etc.
They're not worth tens of millions as well.
They're not worth tens of millions, no. But it's a small... I'm going to say 3, but I could be wrong. I'd have to check. But the intention was to put what limited... And they're not inconsiderable funds, but they're not considerable in the context of what we are talking about here, into a place where they could be seen so that we weren't accused of being opaque as a family.
Just finally, Mr. Walton, you've not had much chance to say much, but have you reviewed Ms. Venning's audit file, and are you happy that everything met EY standards and you'd have done nothing differently yourself?
We stand by the opinion that we signed, yes.
So Stephen, and then I'll ask James.
Yes, you may well have heard on the radio this morning, as I did, Doug Putnam is his name, talking about his efforts to buy the business, to which he says he thought he'd got very, very close to a deal, and at the end it failed, he says, because everyone just got a little bit greedy. What's your understanding of what went wrong there?
Mr. Putnam was one of 20, minimum of 20 conversations that were going on. He was 11th hour, so we heard from the insolvency expert earlier, he actually came in after the business had gone into admin. What he means by everybody being a little bit greedy, I am fairly sure, is the creditors that were owed money at the point of admin. If a new co was to buy the business out of administration, that those creditors, SAP, who kept your IT infrastructure going, would want paying what they were owed from the old company. So that's what he's referring to as greed, in my view.
Okay.
He wanted to pick up for not very much and not pay people who were the creditors who were owed money.
Was he the one who got closest to doing a deal?
I don't think he was. He was one of a number, but it became complicated because of needing funding pre-CVA and post-CVA. So we always had bilateral conversations going on with ABL lenders and equity investors, and there were 20, and different combinations of them would have had the same conversation.
Just very briefly then, Jane, just to wrap up.
Thank you very much indeed. Mr Walton, we have in your brief that you're the EY UK Head of Audit and most notably in the consumer products sector. So I would have thought great experience in one of the big four. We had in 2019, EY was called before our predecessor committee to explain its role in the failure of Thomas Cook. Since then, serious questions have been raised about the quality of your audits of London Capital and Finance and NMC Health. Why does this keep happening? Where is the public interest? And should the big four be broken up?
Few questions there. Let me try and take them in turn. So we take all of those, all of the outcomes of those previous failings, or corporate collapses, I should say, very, very seriously. And the important thing is to try and learn from those mistakes. So if we look at the specific work around going concern, which is the most pertinent point here, since that time we've introduced new training and guidance for all of our people. We've invested in new external data sources to make sure that we can challenge management. And we've encouraged the use of specialists, as Victoria did in this situation, to make sure that the forecasts that are being produced by management are subject to sufficient scrutiny, plus the independent consultation requirements I talked about before. So all of those procedures have been introduced to improve the audit quality and the reliability of the opinions that we provide. In terms of public interest, since the firms voluntarily separated operationally, and that process started back in 2020, the issue of public interest is front and centre. So having a separate ring-fenced business, having independent governance that holds me to account, holds the rest of EY audit to account, to remove any of the financial subsidies that may have existed between the non-audit side of the business and the audit side of the business, and to make sure there's adequate investment in audit quality. Public interest is very much front and centre of our culture.
So why does it keep happening?
Well, I would respectfully put into context the number of cases that you quoted versus the volume of activity that we undertake each year. We sign over 4,000 audit opinions each year. Some of those instances you talk about go back to 2018. So we've signed 20,000 audits in that time.
Understood. Okay, there are some big cheeses, including Wilko, anyway.
Okay, I'm keen to get on to the Minister, so let me wrap this session up. I think this has been a sorry story that we've heard today. We have had you, Ms Wilkinson, admit to a number of significant management mistakes around stock, around range, around furlough. We've heard about a £60 million warehouse modernisation that went wrong, a £40 million loss on financial derivatives, a process of restructuring rents that didn't go through. And despite those problems, you can't explain why dividends went up. We have money sloshing around in trusts that somehow can't be used to refund a pension scheme, and we've got accountants who are prepared to stand by the judgments that they made. We have at least had an apology, but I think we have got a number of questions to now put to ministers. Thank you very much indeed for your evidence today. Order, order. That concludes the session.
Proceeding is currently suspended. The 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 proceeding is currently suspended. The
5-4. Order. Welcome to this third and final session of the Business and Trade Select Committee today. I'm really grateful to you, Minister, and for your colleagues for joining us today to try and draw out some of the lessons from what has been a terrible story that has unfolded here this morning. Minister, perhaps I could just put this point gently to you first. What was it about High Office that made you change your mind about the need for insolvency reform and the need for audit reform legislation?
Some of the practicalities around that, Chair. We're still very ambitious to reform insolvency, and we are making changes to the insolvency process already, including potentially making firms, when we get legislative time available in Parliament, and making firms responsible for making them accountable to regulators. And in terms of audit reform, we are taking forward reforms to audit. As you'll be aware, the FRC, which is taking a much more robust view of audit these days, is doing a much better job and is under good stewardship from Sir Jan du Plessis and from Richard Moriarty, following the very good work from Sir John Thompson. So we've seen a much more effective regime around corporate reform. We're still ambitious in terms of ARGA, audit reporting and governance. So that's something we are wanting to take forward, but clearly parliamentary time doesn't always afford those opportunities.
The story that we heard today is that we had watchdogs that don't bark, an insolvency process that turns pensioners into second-class citizens, and directors who appear to have ignored advice to save their business. And as a result, we've now got the taxpayer on the hook for over £40 million worth of redundancy payments. We've got a £50 million deficit in the pension fund, and we've got creditors who will see maybe 4p on the pound in terms of the money they recover. You said that you're ambitious to continue the reform. Yep. You appear to be so ambitious that you left out legislation from the King's Speech.
Well, not all those things are within my gift, Chair, I would say to you. And but in terms of watchdogs that don't bark, I think, as you just pointed out, there's, I think, in the last year, the FRC levied £40 million in fines on auditors for not doing a job correctly, including KPMG and Carillion, of course. So there are significant changes, I think, in terms of the regime that I experienced in my days as a backbencher, and the regime now is much stronger. And there's further work going, for example, in terms of taking forward things like stronger internal controls in companies. But of course, we're also concerned about the impact on business. We want to see a free market where the UK is an attractive place to do business, and we don't want to put unnecessary burdens on business. So there's always those considerations are taken into account as well when we look at changing regulations and legislation.
But in your firebrand days as a backbencher, you described the insolvency sector as a wild west. Is that still your view?
Well, as I say, we're making reforms to insolvency. We've already put in place some of those reforms, certainly in terms of things like the pre-pack changes we've made and moratoriums we made during the COVID crisis, bringing firms into scope of regulation and improved code of ethics. So there are things we are doing. Am I as ambitious as I was? Absolutely as ambitious as I was. What we've committed to do is put in place those reforms at this point in time, and certainly keeping the need for an independent single regulator under review, and that's where we are at the moment. That regulation is done through the professional bodies, recognised professional bodies. There's been commitments to improve the stewardship of those recognised professional bodies, but certainly I'm, as I say, as I'm ambitious as I've always been in this space.
Slavery.
what a morning we've had. I can assure you.
Yes, I listened to it. Interesting.
Minister Colin Ray. We've had quite a light, quite frightening, to be honest with you. I'm just wondering what the government are going to do to address the issues that face the retail sector in this country. I know you met with Helen Dickinson, the Chief Executive of the British Retail Consortium, and a member of the Retail Sector Council, and I believe you're co-chair of that.
Yep.
And that was to discuss the future of the High Street. I wonder if you can also say what the outcome was of that meeting.
Well, I meet with Helen very regularly. As I say, we're both on the council together. She does fine work in terms of representing the retail sector, and there are many other good retailers on that sector too. It's chaired by Richard Pennycock, who is a very well regarded person with lots of retail experience. So we've produced a report they call the Retail Aggression Enabler, which talks about job prospects, it talks about sustainability, it talks about high streets, it talks about all the things we're all concerned about. One thing I would say about the retail sector is its principal problems are the change in the nature of consumer habits and where they spend money, and we all spend more money online. I think 27% of our monies are spent online now, less than 10% 10 years ago. So this is part of the challenge they are facing. So the world of retail is changing, hence the fact the government stepped in time and time again and looked at support for the retail sector, £13.6 billion in rates support, another £4.3 billion announced in the autumn statement. Many things we are doing in terms of things like high street funds and towns funds to try and make sure that retailers stand a good chance of weathering these difficulties they are facing in terms of the retail environment, but there are challenges. On the bright side, I would say you've seen this year good results from people like M&S, from people like B&M, other retailers have produced good results. So it's not a sorry tale of the terminal decline of the high street, but nevertheless, for some retailers particularly, there'll always be retailers like Wilko where mistakes happen, as well as suffering some of the difficulties we see on the high street.
Wilko didn't say this morning, Minister, that one of the reasons because of the failure was anything at all to do with what you just mentioned. What was suggested was it was as a result of weak leadership, high turnover of directorship and management, the fact that they ignored on many occasions advice given them in which they could change their business. Also a lack of accountability, and that was the main reason. Sure. Wasn't anything to do with what you've just mentioned. It was quite extraordinary, I've got to say, and I think you seriously need to have a look at how this can be avoided in the future. That's a comment rather than a question.
Okay, well, I'd like to respond to it if I may, Mr. Lavery. I mean, it clearly is a very sad day. I mean, the Wilko had almost 100-year history on the high street, 12,000 employees, and I've sat myself in my own business, making people redundant, people I've taken on myself. I knew their families, I knew their friends. I know what a devastating experience it can be for those 12,000 people. So very sympathetic to their problems. But I think what you say there makes my point is that whatever the health or otherwise of the high street and the change on the high street, businesses will make mistakes. And I think it's quite clear in this particular business, mistakes were made. Now, I don't think it's the government's job to step in and ensure that business people or the boards of directors don't make mistakes. That's part of the dynamic of a free market economy. Is a creative destruction takes place every single day on the high street. And I pay tribute to any retailer that makes a success of the high street, but it's not an easy place. It's a very competitive place. You make mistakes and you bear the brunt of it. And I think that's what's happened principally at Wilko.
These weren't deliberate mistakes. So
of course.
There weren't deliberate mistakes.
No,
these were decisions that were made by a company knowing full well what the outcome would likely to be. But I think that's for another time. It's a huge debate, that.
I'm very happy
it's
to
a
have
huge
it.
debate.
Very happy to have it.
Well, and there are sectors of the economy where we do take a more precautionary approach to regulation, like the financial services sector. So we ensure that there are parts of the economy that operate on a prudential regime, and we have regulators to check that they're running their businesses in a prudential way. Okay. And this is one of the questions that I think that is thrown up by this case, because you've got a business that appeared to be ignoring the advice of its advisors, and as a result you've got huge taxpayer losses and 12,000 people out of work. But perhaps I'll come back to that point, because I would like to bring in Mr. Mills about the pension fund.
The chair just set out that unsecured creditors will get something like 4p in the pound, which is pretty tiny. It's not that long ago that the government changed the rules on preferred creditors to reinstate some tax liabilities being preferred, but we still have a situation where a pension deficit, which is effectively deferred remuneration for people from their working lives, ranks as an unsecured creditor. Do you think that's right and fair, that the government should sit ahead of pensioners on their deferred wages?
I don't think that's a particular problem in this case, as far as I know. You may tell me different, Mr. Mills. But in terms of the approach, I mean, we had concerns in this area too. We wrote to the Insolvency Service on the 5th of October. I wrote to the Insolvency Service the 5th of October because of concerns that had been raised in the media and other places. We got a letter back from the Insolvency Service on the 23rd of November where discussions had taken place between the administrator and the pensions regulator, where there was, and the line in that letter that said there's no evidence of director misconduct at this point in time. Now there's further work going on. Clearly this is a huge business and a huge failure, and the director's conduct report is got to be delivered within 3 months, which it has been, but there's more work yet to take place. Officials are meeting with the administrators in January. We're keen to take a second look at this and make sure there is no evidence of director misconduct. I think in terms of the sequence of the order of creditors, it's probably something of a wider discussion. It's an interesting point, and perhaps one we should revisit. But I think the point that was made, I think, by the former chair of the business was that the pension deficit at a point where a business is no longer a going concern is a completely different level than the one that's a going concern. I think it's important we take that into account.
So maybe the going concern value should have a higher ranking as a creditor, not the wreckage value one.
Or the gone concern value, because that's the higher one. I mean, I think if you did that, it would put a lot of businesses underwater. So you would have a potential catastrophic impact on the economy. So I think we've got to be very careful in making those kind of changes, because there would be adverse consequences. And I think there would be adverse consequences, if I could say, Chair, about potentially bringing a prudential regime into the world of business generally. I mean, the Financial Conduct Authority and the Financial Ombudsman Service combined have an annual budget of £1 billion. You're putting billions and billions and billions of pounds into regulation of this economy if you went down that route. So I think we've got to tread carefully in terms of those kind of suggestions.
The reason why I'm asking on the pension deficit is if I'm a supplier of a company, I can check their accounts and I can stop trading with them. I can attempt to seek some security. But indeed, I think we heard that some people did stop trading with Wilko before the problem happened. If I work for a company in the 1990s, I can't really protect myself against them hitting trouble 30 years later when they're still paying me the pension that I've earned. So it kind of feels like they have a right to some greater protection than people who have more of a chance of looking after their own interests.
Yeah, you make an interesting point. I mean, clearly there are requirements already on directors to make sure they only pay out dividends, for example, which I think was a principal part of the conversation I listened to earlier in terms of the evidence that was being given. But from either distributable profits or reserves, and that should also take into account things like pension liabilities, of course. So there is a regime around that. The pension regulator is there now to look at whether the directors did the right thing and whether we're guilty of any misconduct. As I say, the initial feedback we've had is that's not the case. But whether that regime should be strengthened, it's we should always look and review our policies in different areas, and this included.
I think when you heard the history of the dividends, I think you heard the rather convoluted transaction where it looks like money went out of Wilko's to enable one set of shareholders to buy out another set of shareholders at some point, which seems a slightly unusual thing. But no, that it was fine. But what you're saying is all that stuff is being reviewed as if anything inappropriate was done. Presumably, if it was, then steps that we've seen before could be
before? Yeah, I mean, we disqualify around about 1,000 directors every year, and there are steps that can be taken if people have paid out dividends inappropriately to recover those monies from directors or shareholders. So there is a regime around that already, but I think it's only right and proper that you identify wrongdoing first before you go down the track of saying somebody is guilty, and therefore they should of those that misconduct, and therefore they should reimburse. But I think when we see a case like this, of course we want to see improvements. Of course we should question the system and question the individuals concerned. But there are always other consequences of making any changes. I think that's what I'd caution against.
Are you slightly surprised that you can have a holding company that's the wholly owned shareholder of a massive business that goes wrong, and it can have, on the last accounts we've seen, £9 million of listed investments, and yet the director can just sit here and say, well, I've got other responsibilities, I don't need to tip those into the pot to help compensate those who've lost. Kind of just feels slightly not how limited liability of companies was supposed to work in that situation.
Limited liability of companies is a foundation of our market economy.
It makes a mockery of consolidated accounts, doesn't it? Because I can sit here and look at a picture of a whole group, and yet somehow there's £9 million of listed investments, and the taxpayer has to pay the redundancies.
Mr. Mills, you have great experience in this area, of course. I mean, you're very familiar with the accounting profession. That was your profession before this, and so if you said to somebody you've distributed dividends to 10 years ago, for example, a shareholder, and that those monies that were paid to those shareholders and they were dividends they were entitled to, they're on hook for any future conduct of those directors in the even the short, medium or long term. I think that would have significant implications, I think, in the system, whereas a shareholder, you have a right to a dividend that has been paid out on a bona fide basis.
That wasn't what I was suggesting. I was saying I look at the consolidated accounts for the Wilkinson Group. On the balance sheet are £9 million of investments in listed assets is what they disclose. And yet because they're in the holding company and not in the main trading company, that's 99.9% of the other numbers in the accounts. Yeah. Someone can just sit here and say, no, I don't need to put those into the pension fund, I don't need to use those to pay the redundancies, they're kind of mine. I mean, that's not quite what we had in mind, I don't think. I mean, that's not a dividend I'm talking about, I'm just talking about assets sat in a group of companies that hit insolvency.
Well, I think we've got to work with the system we have today, I think, and the system of checks and balances around that is making sure dividends are paid out from distributable reserves or profits, and that's the key requirement. What happens to the money afterwards is not covered by that system unless they've been paid out inappropriately. So
these are assets still sat in the group of companies that
sure.
are being paid out. I mean, that's right.
It may be an unusual situation in terms of the holding company and the trust that sits at the back of it, but that's not really something I can comment too much on.
But you said that this was something that is kept under review, I think. Does that imply that there is a review underway that is going to bring forward new proposals, new regulations, new legislation?
No, that's not the case. We just look at but of course, when any failure happens, you look at it and think, well, has everything been done properly? Do we have the right checks and balances? Are the right requirements made upon directors, for example, or in terms of is the system operating properly? But also within that, as I said previously, you've also got to understand that the vast majority of companies like this do not go bust in this kind of situation. You don't want to have negative impacts on the rest of the free market economy, because it drives everything forward. And every public service that we benefit from is paid for by the private sector, effectively. So we've got to make sure we don't bring about any unintended consequences. So all those things, of course, we look at these things and make sure the system's operating properly, but there's no formal review.
When you looked at the example of Wilko, did you conclude that the system was operating properly?
From what I've seen, and I'm not the administrator, clearly, and the administrator will see far more than I can, and listen to the evidence that was given by the former chief exec and the chair. what I'm seeing, it always appeared that Wilko had made significant mistakes in the lead up to this insolvency, or to this administration, because there are other high street businesses in similar places that seem to be doing well, and there were some specific situations around this high street business where they'd made mistakes, and that became pretty clear very early on. And I think from a business that seemed to be doing well, then suddenly, over a period of time, ends up taking restructuring finance. I think at that point in time, there's been some probably injudicious decisions taken.
Thanks, Chair. Minister, in business there's always going to be error and incompetence.
Yep.
But here we've looked at audit reform, looking at insolvency. The impression is an architecture that just isn't fit for purpose, and nobody's wanting to inhibit growth and entrepreneurial activity at all. But I'm sort of a little bit, well, can I just say I'm a little bit disappointed that, because when you were chair of the APPG, you really had fire in your belly and you did a cracking job. I mean, if chairs referred to it, saying that in terms of insolvency, the people were operating in it more akin to the Wild West than a developed Western economy. The conclusions of our report are clear and extremely concerning, that insolvency practitioners often prioritise the interests of their bank panel paymasters at the expense of other creditors and shareholders. This is totally unacceptable, a clear breach of the duty of care, and this behaviour is not being addressed by the membership organisations whose responsibility is to regulate them. In all this, a minister who we really respect, we were hoping that agenda would have been progressed, because there appears to be a great need for reform. We're not wanting to strangle economic activity, but in these key areas, we appear to be, we've got to just suffer these disasters. We've had so many from BHS in 2016 onwards. How many more do we have to suffer these terrible consequences for our people and our high streets and so on? So
it's a very fair point, Mr. MacDonald, and I think we are making changes to the insolvency process. That was a significant report. I think the one thing that we're not doing that I would like to have seen in that report, that we called for in that report, was a single regulator. Yes. I think that's the only thing you refer to. There are other work happening in terms of making firms accountable in the insolvency profession, in terms of the code of ethics, for example. But in terms of the single regulator, what the decision was taken, bear in mind we're probably in the last year of our Parliament, that it was probably the wrong time to do that. Yes. And but are we still considering a single regulator? Absolutely, that's something we should consider. But I think our view was, given the timings, it was the right thing to implement what reforms we could in the rest of this Parliament, rather than something that wouldn't really take effect had we legislated for that in the last year's Parliament.
And of course, the insolvency service does sit under you. We had it through the P&O crisis, when the insolvency service, to our mind, didn't respond in a proactive way to make sure that didn't happen again. There's no legislative reforms come out of that debacle, and I think, my personal worry is that we're going to be back here time and time again with these collapses unless government gets to grips with this. And as I said to you, not wanting to strangle growth and economic activity, the contrary, but there's got to be better controls than this, surely, to go.
Well, P&O is a slightly different issue, and there was insolvency service did an investigation, decided there was no criminal there's no criminal sanctions available to it. There is still an investigation going on in terms of P&O's approach to that. I think in terms of fire and rehire, it is something we are taking forward in terms of there is a statutory code of conduct and also further damages attached to that an employment tribunal can award, that does mean that employers are less likely to take that approach in terms of fire and rehire, but a slightly different situation. I've got to say, in terms of the reforms we're talking about potentially to insolvency, I don't think any of them apply to this particular case. I think it is connected in terms of the potential insolvencies here, but that's not something, those reforms wouldn't really have made a significant difference to what happened to Wilko.
We do need reform, and that has to happen through
I agree.
legislative change, and we are in the law factory.
Yeah,
also
that's right.
done.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you, Chair.
What is actually holding up insolvency reform then? So, I mean, you've said that the fire in your belly remains, you're keen to make progress. You've pointed to some of the constraints on time in the final year of this Parliament, although, frankly, we don't seem to be rammed with overwork in the legislative programme. I'm sure you could have found some time if government was so minded. Is it because there are just problems that need resolving, and if so, what are they?
Well, we are keen to find time, for example, to bring firms in the scope of insolvency regulation, which they're not currently. They're currently regulated at an insolvency practitioner level. So that's something we want to find time for, hopefully, in this Parliament, and we're keen to do that. But there'll always be competition, not just in terms of the time on the floor of the House, but also in terms of the time taken to prepare legislation. For example, we were here, as you know, till 11 o'clock last night, Mr Byrne, and we'll be here possibly voting later on today as well. So there's, with the new piece of legislation being introduced on the floor of the House, and we've taken forward other key pieces of legislation that you take an interest in: Digital Markets, Competition and Consumer Bill, of course, Data Protection, Digital Information Bill, Minimum Service Levels Bill. All those legislations have been something we've taken through in my year in Parliament. So there's a significant amount of work gone on in various different areas. Of course, there'll always be a prioritisation. We're keen to prioritise this.
But you've agreed there's a problem here that Wilko lights up. There are definitely some needs for reform. There aren't, from what you have said to us just there, particular barriers to getting on with it. It's a case of where the government is putting this in its priority order of legislation.
Of course, which is a government's within the government's gift to do that, and the government's right to do that. It'll always prioritise what it thinks are the most important things. We are taking forward reform in terms.
This is not one of the most important.
Well, we're taking forward reforms in terms of audit. We're taking forward reforms in terms of insolvency. It may not be the perfect reforms that you would like to see, and we're still, as I say, arguing some reform. We're still keen to implement.
You've said yourself that you'd like to see some of these reforms too. It's not just me.
I definitely would. But you know, you've been in government, Mr Byrne, and you know there are competing priorities, and that others have a say in what those priorities will be. But reforms are happening, and we're keen to make sure they are effective. As I say, there's no evidence that I've seen so far that either reforms that we are planning would have made a difference in terms of Wilko going to administration, and that's the salutary lesson here, I guess, is why that happened. It's not for me to dictate to you what you look at when you're taking evidence, but certainly there are some real lessons to be learned in this particular case, but around the management of the company, I think, rather than the insolvency process.
So were you as alarmed as we were when you heard EY basically say that they hadn't made any mistakes on this and they would do the same thing again?
Well, that's something clearly for others to take into account, be that EY or PwC. We have a regime that is proving effective in terms of the FRC. It's shown far more willingness, I think, than in previous years under Sir John Thompson, I must say, to take forward action against auditors, and I think that really has changed the approach some auditors have taken.
You weren't alarmed by what you heard?
Was I alarmed to hear that no mistakes had been made? Well, clearly mistakes have been made. I just don't know who made them.
Okay. So do you think then that there is a case for further and faster audit reform?
Yes, I do. And we're taking forward reform now, and we're keen to take forward further reform, particularly in terms of ARGA, which is the replacement for the FRC. So that would include a civil penalties regime, for example, which it's a much lower barrier than normal in terms of going to court, for example. In terms of being able to sanction people who don't do the right thing. So there are significant opportunities really to tighten up further with that kind of reform, and that's why we're keen to take it forward.
That requires legislation? Or
it does require legislation.
And there's no legislation currently scheduled?
None planned for this parliamentary session.
So it's so important it's not in the legislative programme for this.
As I say, we think we're taking forward the most important things about things like internal controls, non-financial reporting, things like the comply or explain regime. So I met with the FRC only within the last 2 weeks ago, I think, to talk about how they were intend to take forward their reforms, which can be done in a much more fleet-of-foot basis than legislation, which, as you know, takes some time to get through the House and some time to implement in terms of things like secondary regulations.
Finally then, what would you say to those Wilko workers who have lost their jobs during this collapse, who are now looking forward to what is a pretty difficult Christmas, what would you say the government has learned from this to help ensure that we learn the lessons from this so that other workers don't go through what they faced?
Well, I'd like to express my sympathies to all those people, those 12,000 people. As I said before, I've been in, had a very difficult job myself, making people redundant, and people who know their families and their friends. It's a very devastating process because those people have to go back to their homes and explain to their families why they've no longer got a job. So I think it is a very difficult situation for those people. Pleased to say the government has, or the various different government agencies has been very quick to try and make sure people get redundancy protection, of course. Redundancy Protection Service paid out £42 million, average of 1.5 days, but to 9.7 thousand people. And we provide lots of support for people through the job centre and through other programmes to make sure people get back into employment. I think the positive impact of positive side of this, of course, is many other retailers step in where these retailers have failed, take on some of those premises, employ some of those people. So hopefully many of those people have found work in a similar environment. But certainly they have my great sympathies going through a difficult Christmas. Those people haven't managed to find those different opportunities.
I just thought one of the problems facing those people is that they're unlikely, as things stand, to get the full pension which they've contributed for and were promised. Do you think the pensions regulator should use its powers to claw back some of the dividends paid out by Wilko in recent years, mainly to Wilkinson family members, in order to plug the £50 million gap in the pension fund?
If it can identify wrongdoing, yes. But I think it's only right that a fair process needs to be gone through. And so far, the feedback we've had from administrators, through the Insolvency Service and from the pension regulator, they haven't found evidence of wrongdoing. So I think it's important to see wrongdoing first before we make those kind of calls. I mean, I understand people who are already retired get their full entitlement in terms of pensions. You'll know very well, Sir Stephen, but and I think there's a 10% reduction for people who haven't yet retired. So there is a decent safety net. It's not everything, but I think in terms of calling or having a system that requires shareholders or directors to reimburse people or the pension regulator in that situation, I think it's only right we go through a process to identify whether wrongdoing has actually happened.
Thank you very much, Minister and colleagues. That wraps up our third panel today. We're really grateful to you and your team for your patience in bearing with us. It was important for us to hear in full from our second panel, but that concludes this session. Order. Yeah.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.